All right, everybody. Merry Christmas. I didn't plan on doing this. I just figured, hey, what the heck? I'm home. Uh, I guess I don't have anything better to do. Let's do some more meta ethics. Yeah, I didn't do a meta Monday. I was finishing up some other work, so I didn't have a chance. So getting to it now. Welcome everybody. Harmonica Luke, you get 1,000 land salute. I don't see anybody else in the chat just yet. So hopefully some other people will pop in there. So, today I can kind of just do whatever I want. His Dow materials, I like the name. Merry Christmas to you as well. I'll throw everybody up here. All right. So Harmonica Luke for 1,000 land salute. Merry Christmas to you. His Dow materials, 500 land salute. Merry Christmas to you. And Labzor, 250. So Merry Christmas to you. We've got Harry in Puerto Rico. Awesome. Welcome, welcome. And we've got 99 Chronos. How's it going? All right. So we can kind of just do whatever we want today. I do have a video that I can review. You know, that's been the standard thing I've been doing lately. It's not the I'm starting to get a little self-conscious about it. Like I can't just only review videos. I got to do other stuff. I do have my conversation with Derek McAllister and my conversation with Pete Mandic. Although I guess we were kind of reviewing a video, but we got through what, like 10 minutes of the Emerson Green video, and then it was mostly just you know Pete sharing his wisdom. He did just start a Substack. Let me throw that in here now because there's only one post on it, but it is a good one and it's Christmas themed. So let me find that. Ooh. Boop, boop, boo. Here it is. Yeah, Merry Grinchmas. All right, let me throw that into the chat. So go check that out. He was a recent guest on the channel. Oh, I have to add links to his stuff to that video. It's too late for all the people that saw it. They won't get to follow those links, but I'll add them for posterity and for people that show up there later. Check out that link and you'll be able to see his stuff. All right, let's see who else we got here. We've got Zachman. What's up? LMAO says, "Oh, we got Lance Loot now." Yeah, we got Lance Loot. I'm competing with Nathan over Digital Gnosis with the Nathan Nichols, and I think Emerson is starting some kind of currency too. So pretty soon we'll all have currency. Pete Mandic had his own currency. We got Root Beer Guy. Hello from Texas. I can't. I know that I've seen you around with the Root Beer Guy. It's very memorable to me. I really like root beer, which my wife hates it, and so whenever I mention like, "Ooh, I want some root beer," she's like, "Ah." Yeah, Flaming Hell says a Matt Walsh reaction. Well, so what happened is, where is it? I found a video from Sir Sick, who I'll put a link there in the chat. So I don't know who this is. It just came up in the algorithm, or maybe I was searching for videos on relativism. I don't know. I don't remember how I came across it. And it was a review of an old video from Matt Walsh that just is called like relativism is false. Is that what it's called? Why moral relativism is false. And I was like, all right, well, if he's going to cover meta ethics, I'll cover him talking about meta ethics. I don't care who it is. If they talk about meta ethics, I'm happy to talk about what they have to say about it. That doesn't mean I'm going to get into other stuff, like other topics or whatever it is that they're into. But I'm at least happy to discuss his take on meta ethics. So I heard snippets of it in the Sir Sick video, but I was like, "Ooh, no, I want to have more of a sort of a like reaction to hearing it for the first time." So some of the beginnings of it, I think I'll have heard already. I can't recall exactly what it was off the top of my head, but most of this I haven't heard. So maybe only a few minutes. All right, we got more people popping in here. We got Mason saying good evening, Merry Christmas. We got that picture of Jupiter. Um, unless I'm forgetting again, I have this Swiss cheese memory. I can't remember anything. All right, so let's get into the video, and then I don't know what will happen after that. We'll see where things go from there. And again, I heard the beginning of this. I don't remember exactly what was going on in it, and I don't know. I just thought it'd be cool to react to an older video on meta ethics. I did the inspiring philosophy review. So we'll just see how this goes. Okay. Check the volume and we should be good to go. I gotta fiddle with my volume a little bit on my end. Should be good.
Yesterday, I made the arguments that there is no basis for objective morality. without God. As an atheist, you cannot logically assert any kind of objective moral code.
So he says yesterday. So I'm assuming there's another video. So maybe we'll have to go dig that one up. Yeah, I've never heard, like, sometimes Christians or theists more generally will say that without God you can't have objective morality, which is another way of saying moral realism or stance independent moral truths. I've never heard anyone clearly articulate what the contradiction would be, because notice he says here logically, and that would seem to imply that there would be some kind of contradiction between affirming atheism, like the claim that there is no God, and the claim that there are stance independent moral truths. What would the contradiction be? I don't know. It's possible to stipulate that by what you mean by objective moral truth or stance independent moral truth just is something, some type of moral truth that requires a God. That would be very interesting. So it would be a bit like saying, in that case, like if you want to get real trivial with it, moral facts that require God's existence couldn't exist if there were no God. And so that would be true. But what we would want would be, hopefully would be some reason to think that stance independent moral facts specifically require there to be a God. Sometimes you'll hear stuff like you can't have laws without a lawgiver, that kind of thing. It's not, it depends what you mean by a law. So, we have laws of nature, that's using a law in a certain kind of sense, but it's not the same sense in which we have laws that, are passed by countries and are enforced on citizens. And so there's somewhat different conceptions of what a law is there. And as long as you're clear on what you mean by that, like if you mean you can't have the kinds of laws that are created by agents without an agent to create the law, that might be true. But must we conceive of stance independent moral facts as being or requiring laws of that kind? If so, why? Whatever explanation we're going to end up getting, what we're not going to be able to do is to get there by definitional fiat. So someone just stipulating that what they mean by a law or what they mean by an objective moral truth or stance independent moral truth just is the kind of thing created by a God. That's not going to work. So I don't know what his reasoning is. I would be curious to hear it, but I think here the focus is going to be somewhere a little bit different.
Because you have denied God. And I argued that the only thing left for an atheist is moral relativism. That's really the only.
So this is already not true. So let's suppose that moral realism. Let's suppose you reject moral realism. Okay, you're an atheist. You reject moral realism. You somehow agree with Matt here that you can't have objective morality without God. Okay, so what are your options? Well, is relativism your only option? No, not really. So, first of all, there are different kinds of relativism. So, are we talking about appraiser agent relativism, cultural individual relativism? You could, in principle, relativize moral standards to something other than individuals or groups. You could relativize it to a species. You could relativize it to non-agentic or non, like not the standards of individuals. You could relativize it to some sort of objective or stance independent facts. So technically relativism is consistent with moral realism, and it's even consistent, in other words, it's consistent with there being objective moral truths. They can be relativized. It's because technically relativism is something different than stance dependence. So that's something I've been over on the channel before. But in any case, you have all these potential variants of relativism. But even if you set aside all the different types of relativism, you also have constructivist positions of various kinds, which are also stance dependent positions. So, you've got a few problems here. First of all, the claim that your only option is relativism. Well, if you reject moral realism, technically, moral relativism is consistent with moral realism. So that wouldn't be true. What you might say is if you reject the notion that there are stance independent moral truths, then the only kinds of moral truths you could believe in would be stance dependent moral truths. And that might be true. Someone might still quibble and want to draw other distinctions, but even if we granted that that's true, you're stuck with the stance dependent account. So maybe that's roughly what he means by relativism. You don't even have to believe in those. You could be a non-cognitivist. You could be an error theorist. So relativism, even if we construe it very broadly to include all stance dependent accounts, and we rule out various types of realist relativism, we just say, okay, we're gonna set aside all the pedantry and all the terminological hair splitting and conceptual hair splitting that I often do. We just say, okay, maybe roughly what he means is morality that's ultimately dependent on us in some sort of way. If you do that, that's fine. That's going to give you all your relativisms that are stance dependent. It's going to give you all your constructivisms, all that sort of stuff. Those aren't the only options you would be left with, even if we grant all that, because you still have error theory, you still have non-cognitivism, you still have quasi-realism, you still have anti-realist quietism, you have a variety of other positions. Maybe those would in some ways be considered even more objectionable, but they are still options that are on the table. It's just very strange to frame things in terms of, first of all, what's technically not really a dichotomy, which is objectivism versus relativism. That's not a real dichotomy. Um, it's not really like a legitimate distinction because they're orthogonal to one another. But even if relativism broadly construed is intended to reflect all of the sense-dependent accounts, or throwing out all the realist relativisms, and we're including all of the non-relativist stance-dependent accounts, okay, it's still not your only option. Anyway, I'm belaboring that point.
Option that is logically open to them. Now, I'm not going to rehash that argument. You can go and listen to it or watch it if you like. My main objective was just to knock down the idea that it's possible for objective morality to exist in a godless universe.
Oh, we're gonna
I
have to have a
spent
look
30
at that.
minutes trying to do that, so you can go and look at that or listen to that. Quite a lot of feedback to that discussion, much of it ranging from negative to extremely negative. And now what I'd like to do is I'd like to engage what appeared to be the two most frequent criticisms of the position that I expressed yesterday.
Okay, so before we get to that, if someone in the chat doesn't mind, if you could find that other video from Matt Walsh where he, this is episode 97, so maybe it's like 96. I don't know. If you could find that and throw a link in there, that'd be great because maybe we'll take a look at that one.
Now, the first one, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. I did want to mention it, though. There were a lot of people who insisted quite breathlessly that it is possible for an atheist to do good things and be a good person. In fact, as I was told, just because atheists believe that there is no God doesn't mean that they're going to go off killing and raping, etc. You don't need God to be a good person, I was told. And to that argument, I say, yes. Also, who are you what are you responding to, and who are you responding to? Of course, atheists can be moral.
Yeah, this is one of the more frustrating reactions that atheists frequently have to Christians saying, hey, without God, there can't be objective moral truth, is to react by saying, so you're saying I can't be good if God doesn't exist? Which, of course, well, in a certain sense, it might technically be the case that nothing you would do would be good or bad if we're saying, okay, well, the only sense in which things could be good or bad is in an objective sense. There are no objective moral truths, and so nothing could, quote unquote, really be good or bad if atheism are true. But that's conceptually a little bit different than what a lot of atheists actually interpret um, Matt Walsh and other Christians to be saying, which is that you're not capable, if you don't believe in God, of doing good or being good or anything like that. And of course, that is not what any of these people that say you need God for realism are saying at all. They're not saying that. So you have, you have a couple possible confusions. One of them would be the mistaken presumption that when the theist says without God there could be no objective morality, that if you don't believe in God, you can't act in a morally right or wrong way. That is not what that claim entails. There's a sort of intermediate claim, which would be without God, nothing would actually or really be right or wrong. Where actually, really is just a stand-in, kind of a misleading one. Not he's not saying that. I'm talking about how people sometimes use this language um, of saying if there is no God and God is required for there to be moral right and wrong, then nothing would be morally right or wrong if atheism were true. But there's a difference between what atheists believe and what is or is not like true, by presumption, like condition, like on the condition that atheism are true, could anything be right or wrong? And then the answer might be no. That's sort of intermediate. Maybe that's a little too fancy of a claim for people to really have in mind. Usually they make that first mistake of thinking that the theist is saying, if you don't believe in God, then you can't do good or bad things, which of course is not being said. And then you have the correct interpretation, which is that uh, the existence of stance independent moral truths requires there to be a God, and that's all really that's being asserted. Which is still, I don't know what, I've never seen any good arguments for that claim. So it's a kind of a pretty indefensible claim, but people still make it anyway. And it's just important to be sure that people don't misinterpret that. And for whatever reason, it's super duper common for people to misinterpret it as someone saying you can't do right or wrong. I don't know why atheists do this. You know, I've seen the sort of atheist versus theist wars, and atheists make an absolutely embarrassing and ludicrous number of mistakes. They have all their sort of rote talking points and standardized reactions to things, and they do a pretty bad job of engaging with theists. I think, on average, atheists do pretty badly. All right, let's keep going.
Of course, atheists can do good things. I never argued to the contrary. I've never heard any Christian argue to the contrary, honestly. That's not an argument that really exists. It certainly wasn't my argument.
Yeah, so that's fair if that's his position, but Zachman makes a good point. The thing is, a lot of people do believe atheists cannot be good people, and atheists think this is what they mean when they make the moral argument. Yeah, so it very well might be the case that a lot of people are, and this would be more true in the past in the United States than it is now. But there's probably still quite a few pockets of people that are suspicious of atheists or would immediately suspect if a person says they're an atheist, not even like, oh, I'm not religious or oh, I don't believe in God, but I'm an atheist, like you use that term. That could, for some people, raise red flags about your potential character. And I do think that that persists. It persists probably in many places around the world. And atheists could plausibly say that they're legitimately concerned with people having that attitude or fostering that attitude. Nevertheless, that is a separate issue from someone saying you can't have objective moral truth without God. It's just not the same thing.
I didn't argue that atheists can't be good people. I said that atheism provides no rational basis for asserting goodness and badness as objective realities. That's all. That was my argument. I'm not sure why so many atheists struggle to understand this distinction. And it's kind of funny to me that atheists like to impugn the intelligence of believers while at the same time with the whole invisible sky daddy and all that kind of nonsense, while at the same time, which again, there is no Christian above the age of 5 who actually believes that God is in the sky or that he's magical. So, it's another, it's a kind of really stupid straw man that I see that intelligent atheists will use. And it's beneath them to get into that kind of stuff, but they do it. And even here, even among intelligent atheists, there appears to be this inability to understand a really basic distinction and nuance. So, again,
I hate to say it, but I think he's right about this at least. And it's kind of an interesting thing that misunderstandings about meta ethics, which is really what the thesis here is all about, misunderstandings and just a general lack of understanding are incredibly widespread. People just don't seem to know what's going on when people are making meta ethical claims. They frequently conflate them with normative claims and various sorts of you could say characterological claims. They take them to imply or to mean various things other, which strictly speaking are meta ethical claims. So it is true that people mix up meta ethics with all these other things very frequently. So, what else can I say other than, yeah, that sounds right.
and I'm not saying that atheists aren't good. I'm saying that atheism itself, the belief system, provides no basis, rational basis for asserting the objective nature of morality. That's my point. In fact, my argument is actually the opposite of what these critics seem to understand. My whole point, and what I said many times in that episode, is that atheists do act morally, and they do recognize moral goodness, and they do condemn moral evil, which proves that they do recognize the objective nature of morality, even.
Oh, no. So the fact that atheists make moral judgments, they judge things as right or wrong, they condemn things, they act like good or bad people, that does not entail that they recognize that there are objective moral truths. I make this comparison many, many times. Think of food. People that don't believe that there are objective gastronomic truths, like facts about what food is intrinsically good or bad, independent of anybody's taste preferences or attitudes towards the food, kind of a implausible position, I think, at least, that there would be facts about what makes food good or bad that are true independent of our attitudes or taste towards it. I take it to be something approximately subjectivism-ish when it comes to the like food preferences. Now, does that mean that if we go and we find people in a restaurant enjoying their food, hey, do you like that food? Oh yeah, this is delicious. Oh, I didn't like the salad so much, or oh, I really thought the pasta was great. Okay, well, those people are praising food. They're expressing disgust towards some food. They think some food is good, some food is bad, some food is excellent. Does that mean that they recognize that there are objective taste truths? No. For whatever reason, many people seem to think that if you engage in normative judgments and evaluations, if you condemn things, if you consider things right or wrong, good or bad, that somehow implies or entails or is evidence that you think those things are objectively right or wrong or good or bad. Why? Why do they do this? Matt just got finished making an accurate point about a common misunderstanding that atheists have towards theists when theists say, without God, there could be no objective moral truth, which is that they mistakenly take this to imply that you cannot be morally good or bad if you don't believe in God or if God doesn't exist or whatever. It's not that clear what they think because whatever it is, it's something very confused. He's right about that. But then he immediately pivots towards making an apparently mistaken claim of his own, which is that uh, you know, to the extent that atheists go around making judgments and considering things right or wrong or good or bad, that somehow suggests that they recognize objective moral truths. No, it doesn't. It doesn't suggest that any more than people enjoying food suggest they think there's objective gastronomic truths. There is a distinction between first order judgments and second order judgments. First order judgments would be things like stealing is wrong, lying is wrong, helping people is good, compassion is good. And then second order judgments, that would be stuff like when people make moral claims, they mean this, or the nature of moral truth is this. They are claims about morality. They're claims about the content, structure, or nature of the first order claims. So that's why they're second order claims. Meta ethics is a position about it's a second order position about the nature of first order moral claims. So when people go around making first order moral claims, that is consistent with pretty much every anti realist theory out there. A relativist isn't incapable of judging things as right or wrong. I mean, after all, relativism is a view about the nature of moral truth. It holds that moral truths are relative. It doesn't deny that there's moral truths. It's not some implication of relativism that you don't make moral judgments. Of course, you make moral judgments, just like you make judgments about what food is good or bad. Now, want to head off another common misunderstanding is that when you compare morality and taste in this way, people go, oh, so you're saying morality is just like taste? This is one of the dumbest, stupidest, worst objections people have. Again, I'm just talking about a common objection. Matt has not raised this concern. But one of the things people do is if you compare two things with respect to one characteristic, people will, for whatever reason, think you're comparing them in one or more other characteristics. So if I compare morality to taste by pointing out that the fact that people make first order moral judgments and first order taste judgments does not entail that they're realists about taste or morality, that does not mean that I think, for instance, that moral judgments are of similar importance to taste judgments, or that moral judgments are identical to taste judgments in terms of their scope, which would not be true. In many cases, when people make taste judgments, they're only concerned with what they taste, and they're not concerned with what other people taste. And so they wouldn't say it's wrong for or it's bad for other people to have pineapple on pizza just because I don't like it. They might say, look, I don't like pineapple on pizza. I don't care what other people eat. Whereas with morality, you might say, yeah, I think it would be wrong for me to steal, and I think it'd be wrong for anybody else to steal. And this was very good reasons for people to be stealing. And they could say the same for a variety of other things. The difference there is that moral concerns are often normative or evaluative claims about other people's conduct, not just your own conduct, and taste claims are often not. That's a difference, but I'm not saying that they're similar or different in that respect. I'm only comparing them in terms of the fact that if a person says this is tasty or gross, that does not mean that they must be a gastronomic objectivist or realist. Likewise, if a person says that was morally wrong or I condemn that, that does not entail that they are a realist. I don't know why people make this mistake. And, there is some unfortunate irony in him criticizing people for a misunderstanding and then immediately exhibiting a misunderstanding. Super duper common. All right, let's keep going.
Even if it contradicts their worldview. That was my point. So the point I made is that yes, there are plenty of good atheists who understand. In fact, all of them recognize moral goodness. That was my point that I was trying to make.
Yeah, okay. Recognizing moral goodness does not mean recognizing objective moral goodness. I recognize the tastiness of chocolate. That doesn't mean I recognize the objective tastiness of chocolate. Why can't people get these things straight?
Um, now, you notice that atheists will tend to have this confusion actually on the other side too, because many arguments with atheists, in my experience, will devolve into the atheist listing all of the alleged crimes and atrocities committed by religious people. I cannot tell you how many times I've had a debate or an argument with an atheist about the existence of God or something along those lines, and eventually they start talking about the Crusades and the Inquisition. Now, the fact that they reveal themselves to have very little understanding of those historical episodes is beside the point. The real point is that the Crusades, the Inquisition, the sins of the religious people are completely irrelevant to the question of whether or not God exists. I was watching a debate with Christopher Hitchens recently, and
Yeah, again, I don't entirely disagree with him. Someone might be able to somehow leverage, what is it, the moral fruits type arguments. There's ways of potentially leveraging the conduct of Christians historically or contemporaneously as some sort of argument against Christianity or against, or, for theists against God or something like that. I tend to not find those sorts of arguments particularly persuasive. So to the extent that he's frustrated about that, okay, once again, I think he's pointing to a common weakness in a lot of atheist reactions towards theists.
And he went on this whole tangent about the alleged wickedness of Mother Teresa. Now, Hitchens was a brilliant guy, but this was an amazingly erroneous and pointless rant, as it obviously has no bearing at all on the question of whether God exists or not. Makes no difference. You can say whatever you want about Mother Teresa. It has nothing to do with anything. So it seems that some atheists tend to think that arguments about God are really a contest over who, between atheists and religious people, are the best people. But that is not the argument. And that is just not an argument that I've ever heard a Christian make. I've never, ever heard a Christian say that, Christians are the best people in the world, and if you are a Christian, then it prevents you from doing bad things. And if you're
Yeah, they might not argue that they might not claim if you're a Christian it prevents you from doing bad things, but I would be surprised if there were no Christians, or even if there weren't a significant number who think that Christianity has some sort of, salutary effects on people's conduct. Do Christians generally think that there is no difference in the quality of moral character between Christians and non-Christians? That would be an interesting thing for them to hold, that becoming a Christian or being a Christian has no like average increase in positive moral behavior relative to non-Christians. That would be a strange thing to believe, I would think. So why wouldn't they believe on average that Christians are maybe a little bit better than non-Christians? I mean, maybe they don't think that, but I would be curious. That seems like an empirical question.
an atheist, then all you do is bad things and you're out raping and killing. I've never heard that argument. I honestly have not once ever heard it expressed from a Christian. So we can put that to the side. Second,
Yeah, so let's have a look at the chat before we move on. Oh, we got Nitty here. What's up, Nitty? Glad to have you here. And yeah, that's it. Good old Tom Koth has his Objective Morality videos, episode 96. I think I can't link in chat. Maybe it prevents people from throwing links in here. Unless it's me, I could put a link in here. Maybe a mod can put a link in here. I don't know. All right, let's see what else we got here. Nitty suggests transcendentally means objective to them. It might mean that, but if that's the case, then they're not using the term in the same way that people are using it in contemporary meta-ethics. So then if by objective they mean transcendental or transcendent or something like that, transcendently, the moral facts have to exist transcendently. That might just be exactly the kind of thing I was worried about, which is that they're sort of defining objective morality in such a way that it would require a God. Um, that wouldn't be very interesting if so. And then he has some comments on divine command theory. I'm not going to litigate those. I'd like to bring on someone that knows more about divine command theory to talk about that, because I think a lot of divine command theorists would end up construing the position in a way that would be a realist way of construing, and a lot of people have this kind of a very straightforward and simplified version of divine command theory. But I think the actual versions a lot of theists advocate for that do advocate for those positions, they're more robust than that, and we should give philosophers of religion that touch on metaethics their due when they actually do so. All right. Hayden says Hitchin's still living rent free in these people's heads. Yeah, I never was that into the Hitchin stuff. Let's see. Zachman says if Christianity were true, Christians should be morally superior. Christians are not morally superior, therefore Christianity is not true. Yeah, you would have to spell out the inference chain. Like there would have to be some reason to think that if Christianity were true, then adherence to Christianity should be expected to be morally better on average or something like that when you control for other variables. I do know that inspiring philosophy, Michael Jones has done a lot of work looking into the empirical literature to defend the claim that like Christians are worse on average than non-Christians. But I haven't. That would take a lot of work to go dive into all of that stuff to investigate whether that's true or false. So I guess you could go search up his videos and have a look. So there you go. I'm tipping you off to people that would very much disagree with me on most issues, but I don't know enough to know about that to say one way or the other. So you know, I can't definitively say that religious versus non-religious people are more ethical on average or not without looking at it's an empirical question. I can't just armchair it. Oh, I'm not religious, so we got to be the winners. It doesn't necessarily follow. And there's a lot of factors here. Other it's not like if non-religious people were less ethical on average than religious people, that would mean that being non-religious makes you less ethical because it's correlation. It's not necessarily some sort of causal effect of being non-religious. So there'd be a lot of very tough empirical questions to deal with there, and there would be so many confounding variables. It'd be very hard to tease everything apart. Maybe someone's done it. I haven't, so I couldn't judge on the matter. Oh, right. Megarit says there are a lot of Christians who think the Holy Spirit makes Christians become morally better and than they'd otherwise be, than they were before becoming Christians. Right. So if Christianity even makes some Christians become better people, uh, you know, that that could be leveraged to say, okay, well, does it do a better job than becoming something else other than a Christian? Because then we might expect, okay, well, even if most Christians don't change very much, as long as some of them become better, all else being equal, that gives an advantage, morally speaking, to Christianity. But of course, maybe becoming a Buddhist makes you more moral, or maybe becoming a Stoic makes you more moral. I don't know. Nitty says, Lance, I was face to face with a Christian from my It's Best to Be an Atheist sign, and she looked me dead in the eyes and said, without Jesus, she'd cheat on her husband and leave her kids. Yeah, I don't. Some people might say that, but say things like that, and I've heard things like that from Christians, and that might be true of some of them, but I don't. I don't. Generally speaking, I think that those that's like rhetoric. I don't really think that people would actually just go out and become like super awful people if they became atheists. At least most of them. It might be true of some of them, and if that's the case, I hope they stay Christian because I'd rather someone have different religious beliefs than me and not do terrible things than do terrible things just to agree with me. I'm not I'm not that dogmatically invested in atheism. I don't really care that much. If like a God shows up, all right, I guess I was wrong. And of course it'd be more dramatic than that. I'd be like, damn, I was super mega wrong. Gee, I wouldn't just be like, whatever. I am intellectually capable of just changing my mind on a dime without it causing. No, it would mess with my head quite a bit, and I would have to come to terms with how catastrophically wrong 20 years or whatever. But I don't know how I'd react. How if a God shows up? Like I'm going to be able to predict that? I don't know. Okay. No, theists and apologetics does not use objectively like you. Right. I don't think that they do, but it would be helpful if they got clear on precisely what they mean by it. And it is a little unfortunate that that term is bandied about and different people use it in different ways. Harmonica Luke says, I've been told it's dangerous to believe morality is relative, normative, entitlement without even misrepresenting a response. Yeah. So a lot of people seem to think relativism is some kind of danger. And there's a difference between the sort of broad folk relativism that I spoke with Derek McAllister about, which might very well be dangerous. If you endorse a kind of relativism where you're like, well, that society says it's okay for that society. And everybody has their right to their own beliefs and you shouldn't interfere and impose your standards on others. That does seem kind of dangerous to me. So if there's people on the other side of the border and they just decide to go genocide people, you just go, well, it's their culture. I guess it's okay. I wouldn't be okay with that. So that seems like a pretty scary form of relativism. So if you have a type of cultural agent relativism that breeds complacency, ambivalence, or indifference towards, like human rights violations, that's a bad relativism. And anti-realists should not be averse to pointing out when certain sorts of views have negative consequences, and that view would. The thing about that, though, is that what makes it so terrible is the normative consequences, not the meta-ethical ones. So, it's not that I don't think meta-ethics one way or another is going to make people typically tend towards like really egregious, terrible moral behavior or make them really saintly and wonderful. I think it has very little impact on our behavior. What matters is what matters really is going to be our attitudes, our motivations, and our normative moral standards. I don't think meta ethics has much to do with it. I almost caught up in the chat. Cool, cool. Lots of cool comments here. Okay, cool. Let's keep going.
This is where I want to spend the most time. I heard from quite a few people who said, who openly said that, morality is not objective. You're right.
Mhm.
Atheism provides no basis for objective morality, and that's because
It's a little weird. So, atheism isn't going to provide or fail to provide a basis for objective morality one way or another. Whatever reasons one would have for thinking that there are objective moral truths would be somewhat autonomous from that fact. So there look, the world is going to be metaphysically quite different if there is a God versus if there isn't a God. And so if there is a God, the precise way in which you get your moral realism might be distinctive to that theistic account. It doesn't have to be. You could be like a Platonist and a theist or something like that and think that moral realism of some Platonist kind would be true whether or not there was a God. I don't know. You might end up thinking God is necessary and then that wouldn't really fly. But you could think that you could be, in other words, you could be a theist and a moral realist and not think moral realism requires God. Uh, you could be an atheist and not endorse moral realism, but that doesn't entail that you think that, well, you couldn't have realism. An atheist could think, yeah, well, moral realism is like logically consistent with atheism. I just don't think it's true. So that is probably the view that the vast majority of contemporary analytic philosophers have. I don't know about vast. You have what, 70, 80% are atheists. Of those, probably very few think that moral realism is inconsistent with the moral realism is inconsistent with atheism. It's probably not a particularly common view. So it's very likely a majority. I don't know the exact numbers, and I don't put that much stock in what a majority of philosophers think anyway. I mean, there's fashions and trends in philosophy, so does it really matter that much? Not really. The bottom line is it's going to turn on the quality of the arguments, and I think that probably the persistence of this notion that you can't have moral realism without God is largely due to a failure of communication between the apologetics and philosophy of religion, whatever is feeding into this view, and contemporary analytic metaethics, because the way that realism in or objective morality is typically construed in contemporary academic philosophy, it'd be real weird to think that you couldn't have objective moral truth in principle without a God. There's just no particular. You're just going to have naturalist accounts. You're going to have like unless you want to say naturalist accounts are logically impossible, or some type of intuitionist account is logically impossible. That is going to be a tough sell for pretty much anybody in contemporary analytic philosophy. And the thing is, I am an exception to that because I might be perfectly fine saying those types of realism are not possible. I just would also think that a theistic based conception of realism is And so I might just say none of them are possible. And so technically, on my view, you can't have moral realism without God, but you also can't have moral realism with God. So I, that's going to make that a little bit weird because I'm like, well, technically speaking, if P then Q, I'm going to have to affirm that that's true. But that doesn't carry the implications that I think that theists want to get out of it, which is not just you can't have realism without God, but also that you can have realism with God. I think you can't have it without God and you can't have it with God. Anyway, all right, let's keep going.
There is no objective morality. There's only what we think is good or bad, which is a preference that depends on culture, evolution, personality, and so on. So this is moral relativism.
Yeah, by the way, that sounds about right. That doesn't entail moral relativism, though. Moral relativism, just to be clear for everybody, specifically is the view that moral claims contain an implicit indexical element whereby the truth of the moral claims is relativized to the standards of different individuals, groups, or whatever other standard you're relativizing it to. The key feature of relativism is this indexing component where it allows the truth status of a particular moral proposition to vary based on the inclusion of the index. So that would be like if I say I am Lance, if I say that it's true. If you say it and you're not Lance, it's false. So that sentence, I am Lance, is sometimes true and sometimes false. So relativism is a view that moral claims are like that. They are sometimes true and sometimes false, or at least potentially true or potentially false, depending on which standards they're being relativized to. That's what relativism is. It's about standards being relative, but relativism leaves open what they're relativized to. Typically, in practice, they are relativized to the standards of individual preferences or values or whatever it might be, or the standards or values of cultures or groups. And so, in practice, almost every actual form of relativism anybody would take seriously is a type of anti realism, but it's not a type of anti realism because of the indexing. It's not a type of anti realism because the truth status of the moral claims could vary depending on who they're relativized to. What makes it a type of anti realism is that the truth claims depend on our stances. But in principle, it's not like relativism would become realism if everybody died except one person. Because think about it. If everybody died except one person, the truth status of the claims would not vary because the claims would only be being made by one person. And so they'd all be true or false according to that person's standards. And so their claims wouldn't be indexed to other people's standards. Now, you could say, but you could still hypothetically index, and that would be true. So that person could say, well, things are right or wrong relative to my standards, and they would be right or wrong in a different, like that could be inverted relative to the standards of the people that used to exist. So you could get around it that way. But you still have stuff like ideal observer theory that are going to jettison the relativism but maintain stance dependence. I know I harp on about this, and this is like a really academic, goofy kind of thing, but the details here matter. And they matter because while these details are often kind of complicated and a little weird, it is nevertheless the case that if someone rejects moral realism, they're often treated as having few, if any, defensible options. And so, if you're going to say, well, if you're not a realist, then you're a relativist, this is often then framed in terms of agent relativism. And this is taken to have all these horrible implications. And then, you're on the philosophical chopping block for having stupid view when that isn't the only option that's available to you. You could be an ideal observer theory. You could be some kind of anti-realist constructivist. Could be like, for instance, a Humean constructivist. You could look up Sharon Street's work on that. There's other people that have written about that. So you do have other options. And, why are these dismissed? Because I think people just don't know about them. And that's unfortunate.
What I was doing yesterday is I didn't really, I was trying to demonstrate that as an atheist, the only thing really open to you logically is moral relativism. Although I didn't really get into trying to disprove moral relativism, so that's what I'm going to try to do now. I'd like to explain why.
So he's going to try to disprove it. So I want to address this remark from Keta Minerva. This is very low fruit. So part of my goal in advocating for the sorts of positions that I have is to raise the sort of general awareness about the defensibility or indefensibility of various philosophical positions. And that's very difficult to do if there is an atmosphere of misunderstanding, miscontrol, misuse of terminology, inconsistent terminology, all basically widespread misunderstandings, rhetoric, smear campaigns, all sorts of stuff that stands in the way of dealing with things purely as an academic topic. So, outreach and raising the sort of a public waterline of understanding is an important part of making positions that might otherwise be reflexively dismissed or rejected fall within that you could say like the Overton window of consideration for people that might otherwise not consider them. So you could say it's very goal. I don't know if you're actually saying I shouldn't be covering this material or not. I think it's important, and it's important for similar reasons as someone, for instance, critiquing creationism is important. Sure, if a person is critiquing a creationist, it might not be a an evolutionary biologist that's super knowledgeable, but it's still important to make sure that the public understands topics that they might otherwise misunderstand. Maybe that's a more important one than meta ethics, but meta ethics is the one I've opted to defend against a lot of popular misconceptions about it. Now, some of my discussions are with academics and professors, and some of them are covering sort of popular coverage of these topics. I think both are important.
I think that moral relativism is false. Why I believe that morality is certainly objective. And I guess before we do that, we have to get in. I guess we have to define our terms. So, on one hand, you have moral relativism, which is the belief that there is no underlying moral truth. There's no moral truth at all. Morality is both subjective and
Hold up. Let me take that back.
relative. On one hand, you have moral relativism, which is the belief that there is no underlying moral truth. There's no moral truth at all.
Really, Matt? You should know better than that. All right. I'm tempted to pull up some sort of like Stanford Encyclopedia entry definition about relativism, but I'll just talk about it. So the issue with this is just straightforwardly not true. Relativism is not the view that there's no moral truth. Relativism actually specifically and explicitly is a view according to which there are or can be moral truths. It's a view about the nature of moral truths. And relativism is a type of cognitivist position. So within contemporary metaethics, you have a distinction between cognitivism and non-cognitivism. Cognitivism is the view that moral claims are capable of being true or false, at least in principle. So relativism is a type of cognitivist position. It holds that moral claims express propositions. Propositions are statements that are capable of being evaluated as true or false. And that distinguishes them from other sorts of utterances which could not be true or false in principle because of the nature of the content. So that'd be things like imperatives. Shut the door. They can't be true or false. Or ow. That can't be true or false. Or questions. Hey, what are you doing? That can't be true or false. So cognitivists say, hey, when people make moral claims, like when people say torturing babies for fun is wrong, they're saying something that could be true or false. Now, relativists say they can be true. Some moral claims are true, some moral claims are false, and then they have a position on what it is that makes the moral claims true or false. And for relativists, what makes them true or false will typically be the standards of individuals or groups, and you could further subdivide it. But is just is a position according to which there are or at least could be moral truths. It is not a view according to which there's no moral truth. That is just not true, and it's really unfortunate that he's characterizing it this inaccurately.
Morality is both subjective and relative in this view. So, what
Both subjective and relative. I wonder to what extent he would draw a distinction between the two.
is right and good depends on my own perspective.
So why would he say they think there's no moral truth and they think that what's right or good depends on your perspective? What they think is like the moral truth depends on their perspective. That would be another way of framing it.
That's subjective, and it depends on circumstance. So, it's relative is both subjective
more
and relative in this view. So, what is right and good depends on my own perspective. So, that's subjective, and it depends on circumstance. So, it's relative in that sense.
Yeah, relativism is not the view that moral claims depend on circumstances. So you could call that maybe something like I don't know that there's a good technical term for it. Contextualism, situationism, something like that. So there would be a view like, hey, is stealing morally right or wrong? Well, it depends on why the person is stealing. What is the context in which the theft is, has occurred? If a person is stealing from a terrorist, like a terrorist is going to go plant the bomb and then they steal the bomb so they can't set it off, then that would be a morally good act of theft. But if they're stealing because they just want to make more money so they could go on a fancy vacation in the Bahamas and they don't care about other people's welfare and they rip off a bunch of elderly people through insurance fraud or something like that, okay, well, that's unethical stealing. So in that case, you would say, okay, well, the general idea of taking someone else's property or whatever without their consent, stealing, whether that's right or wrong depends on the context. So that is a feature of first order or normative moral claims. It's not a meta-ethical position, and it doesn't really have to do with what relativism as a meta-ethical position. Relativism as a meta-ethical position would say that whether or not a moral claim is true or false depends on the standards of individuals or groups or whatever it's being relativized to. Now, subjectivism is sometimes used interchangeably. Sometimes it might be used to refer to stance-dependent accounts specifically, or sometimes it's used, and this is the way I tend to use it, to mean a type of individual relativism. So I tend to use subjectivism to mean moral claims are true or false depending on the standards of individuals, as opposed to cultural relativism, where moral standards are right or wrong according to the standards of different cultures or societies or groups or whatever it might be. So basically, I use subjectivism to draw a distinction between individual relativism versus group relativism. And so subjectivism on that view is a type of relativism. But here he seems to be saying subjectivism means it's true or false relative to your perspective. And then relativism is it's true or false according to the context. That's a somewhat weird way of using relativism. At the very least, it's not a meta-ethical way of using it. And it doesn't look like he has a clear sense of how these terms are typically used, at least in contemporary metaethics, but maybe he's not intending to use them in in contemporary metaethics, or at least like in accord with how they're used in contemporary metaethics. If so, it is a little confusing and weird what he's talking about when he's criticizing relativism, because sensitivity to context, like, hey, whether something is right or wrong depends on the context. One, that's completely consistent with moral realism, or this idea that there's objective moral truth. And two, why would an objectivist or a realist be? I'm using these terms interchangeably. He's saying objective. I prefer the term realism. Uh, they're not typically going to be against that. So, it's not like moral realists have to think that moral rules are absolute and exceptionless. And, if stealing is wrong, it's always wrong. And if lying is wrong, it's always wrong. It's very likely many, if not almost all people that are Christians or theists or moral realists or whatever it might be, that they're going to be sensitive to context. So it's a weird way of using the term relativism. It's unlikely that very many people would be against sensitivity to context, but maybe he means something idiosyncratic by that. I don't know.
On the other hand, objective morality is the belief that moral standards, moral truths, and moral responsibilities exist independent of my own preferences or opinions.
Not a bad characterization. Nothing to say about that. Okay, fair enough.
In other words, some actions are really good and some are really.
There we go. Really good. Okay, so this is what I call a deceptive modifier, and I have a blog post on this where I call it the fake cheese fallacy. So, someone might say now made with real cheese, on like a box of macaroni and cheese or something like that. So that implies that other people are making stuff with fake cheese. So this is something that a lot of realists will do when describing anti-realist moral positions, which do hold that things are morally right or wrong. So they'll say, well, they don't think things are really right or wrong. And if you're a realist, you think things are really right or wrong, or actually right or wrong. What's the exact language?
Really, moral standards, moral truths, and moral responsibilities exist independent of my own preferences.
See, that sounds fine.
Or opinions. In other words, some actions are really good and
are really good.
Some are really bad, and
some are really good and really bad. So what is meant by really? Again, note the implication. If you're a realist, you think things are really good or bad. If you're an anti-realist, you don't think they're really good or bad. I call this the fake cheese fallacy because it inappropriately helps itself to the presumption that the realist's conception of what would make something right or wrong is somehow establishes the only viable one. So in other words, if you're a realist and you think moral realism is true, You think things are right or wrong in the realist sense. That is, their stance independently right or wrong. So you might think from the realist perspective, if an anti-realist is running around saying things are right or wrong in some subjective stance dependent sense, that's not like the correct account of good or bad, right or wrong, morally speaking. And so they don't actually think things are morally right or wrong or good or bad, because the correct characterization of things being right or wrong is in the stance independent. In other words, the non-subjective, the non-relative sense. And so that person is incorrect. And therefore, their conception of what's right or wrong isn't a real conception of what's right or wrong. Things aren't really right or wrong in the subjective sense. But no, that position is helping itself um, to the presumption that the anti-realist is wrong. And so when you're framing uh, the dispute between realists and anti-realists, and you're describing it, saying here's what realists think, here's what anti-realists think, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to say, if the realists, we think things are really wrong and anti-realists don't. Well, an anti-realist would say, let's say you're a subjectivist. If you're a subjectivist, you reject realism. You don't think anything stands independently right or wrong, but you can, and especially if you're subjectivist, you do think things are stance dependently right or wrong. And so look, switch your perspective and adopt the subjectivist framework. Things are right or wrong in the sense subjectivists think that they are, and critically, they're not right or wrong in the sense that realists think they are. So the subjectivist could say, it's actually we who think things are really right or wrong. It's realists that don't think things are really right or wrong. Why? Well, from the subjectivist perspective, things are only right or wrong in the sense the subjectivists think they are, and they are not right or wrong in the sense that realists think that they are. And so nothing is actually right or wrong, stands independently. So the sense in which realists think things are right or wrong, they're wrong. Nothing is right or wrong in that sense from the subjectivist perspective. So do you see the problem here? The problem when you frame realism as the view that things are really right or wrong is you're implicitly presupposing that the realist has the correct conception of morality, when it's not just a question of whether which one of these positions is correct. There's a further question about which one has the correct characterization of morality, and realists aren't entitled to just help themselves to that presumption. So they still do anyway, and they end up framing anti-realism as though we have to accept the framing that we don't think anything is really right or wrong. We've got fake cheese, they've got the real cheese. And this is a weird thing to do. Now, if you have real cheese and someone else has fake cheese, they could say, yeah, you've got the real cheese, I've got the fake cheese. You got real vanilla, I've got imitation vanilla. But anti-realists aren't committed to saying that things would only be really right or wrong if realists are correct, and we just have some sort of fake version of right or wrong. Anti-realists can say, no, we have the correct account, or a correct account of rightness and wrongness, and you are incorrect. And it's actually your framing that's misguided. So this is a thing. I think it hints at the possibility that many realists struggle to conceptualize things from an anti-realist perspective, and seem to think that they're in some sort of privileged position to frame their position as being the only one according to which things would really be right or wrong. And that use of really, I think, is concealing, well, they'd only be really right or wrong if they're stance independently right or wrong, on the presumption that it's a realist making this sort of claim. So why use the term really? So, hey, all those people over there that don't believe in non-relative moral truth, they don't really think. You could substitute that for, they don't think there's non-relative moral truth. Well, of course they don't think that. That's what the position is. So it's really weird. And again, you could push the gastronomic analogy once more. Okay, so people that enjoy or hate pineapple on pizza, they don't really enjoy or hate pineapple on pizza because they're not objectivists or realists about pineapple on pizza. They're not, so they don't really like it. Hey, you know how you don't like the taste of that thing you hate, cilantro or whatever it is? Well, you don't really dislike it because it's subjective. And things are only, your like judgments about what's good or bad are only real if they're objective. That is, if they're stance independent. And so you can't actually think any food is really good or bad. So you might as well, what? You might as well eat garbage. It doesn't matter what you eat. You see the problem here? It's really weird because I think Matt and most moral realists would agree that food can can really taste good or bad. It can really be tasty or gross. And there we don't use the term really with the presumption of realism. So why are we using it that way in the case of morality? Why why stack the deck rhetorically with terminology like this? This is just massively common in framing of realism and anti-realism, even with people that are are fairly knowledgeable about the topic, they continue to misframe the dialectic and present it as though only realist conceptions of morality are legitimate. That is precisely one of the matters under contention here. You're not entitled to help yourself to the presumption that we're wrong. If you think we're wrong, present your case, argue for it. But framing with deceptive language, I'm not saying that it's intentional, but the language is misleading and will confuse people, and people should avoid using language that way. I think in most cases they're not aware of it, and so I don't think people are going around actively and or intentionally misleading people. But I do think this when realists say things are really right or wrong, I think that's a bit of rhetoric, and I think that needs to be avoided. It's not good philosophy, if nothing else. All right, let's have a look at the chat, and then we'll keep going. All right. All right. Megarit says theistic apologists like Walsh tend to be especially bad at dismissing both realist moral naturalism and the diversity and sophistication of moral anti-realists, moral anti-realisms. I think a lot of them are not aware of these positions, but to the extent that they are, I rarely see much interaction with them. Lots more comments here. Yeah, Hannah is giving a alternative definition of relativism, but he's trying to give a definition of relativism. So I don't know if that works. You might have said that before he started giving an account of what he means by relativism. So Pierre is here. Merry Christmas. We got the Christmas trees. All right. You got DJ Bambarino. Oh yeah, I'm actually here for a stream. Looking forward to hearing your perspective on this video, Lance. Great. So Pierre says actual real cheese is way better than fake cheese. Cheese, real cheese, and actual cheese. We know this is obvious. Okay. Andrea says, "What's the position I hold? The position on what? On meta ethics? So the term I'm using right now, because there's no formal sort of name for my position. I don't fall in someone else's camp. Got to make my own. I'm calling it anti-realist quietism. So I think that the categories and distinctions that characterize the contemporary academic literature are misguided. They rely on assumptions that I don't accept. And so while I don't think that moral realism is true, I also don't endorse any of the existing anti-realist positions. So I kind of fall outside the box. And because I think that the contemporary dispute is framed in terms that I reject the framing, I think that it relies on assumptions that we ought to reject. I think that the problems they're trying to solve within that framing should be abandoned. And that's what makes me a kind of quietist about that particular discourse. Doesn't mean I'm a quietist more generally, although I am a quietist about a lot of things. But on this particular issue, I've gone into detail about this before. The issue has to do with the way a lot of basically contemporary meta ethics centers on these semantic theses, and I reject the views about language that seem to be underwriting them. If not the views about language, and the methods they're using to address the questions.
Remain good or bad, even if I think otherwise. Even if everyone in the world thinks otherwise, the moral truth remains. So maybe instead of objective morality, we could call it actual morality. I don't know. Maybe that's a better term. But the point is that this belief holds that
It is not a better term.
immoral actions are actually immoral. That is per se immoral. And moral actions are actually moral. That is per se moral. And just as we have actual moral obligations to do certain things and not do others.
Yeah, he's really leaning into this use of actual here. And he also used really earlier. So this is exactly what I just spent a few minutes talking about, how this is a very misleading way of framing things. Why, if relativism was true, would things not actually be right or wrong? Why would they be it's how is that like fake rightness and wrongness? Again, like, does he think that music can't actually be good or bad unless it's objectively good or bad? That food can't actually be good or bad unless it's objectively good or bad? I wouldn't think that he would. I'm guessing he wouldn't think this in these other domains. If he would, I mean, at least he'd be consistent. But it's a weird way to talk, and I do think it's misleading. Even if he would, it still doesn't get rid of the problem. Then I would just find that objectionable in all the domains and not just this one. But this notion of actual goodness or badness if you're a realist and not if you're some type of anti-realist or relativist. Uh, it gives the impression that relativists are stuck with thinking like they've only got like a fake kind of morality. And of course, a relativist could just say, no, we don't. We have a completely real kind of morality. It's actually your morality that's not real. So relativists would be in just as good of a position to say that they have actual morality and actually realists don't.
And those obligations exist whether or not we recognize them, or whether or not we choose to follow them, or whether or not we like them. Right. So, how do I prove this? Well, I'm not going to make an exhaustive argument here, but I will mention 2 points for consideration. One, I think we have to start with, my first piece of evidence for objective morality that I would present is your own moral intuition. I mean, your own.
Oh boy. Okay. Yeah. So I don't have realist intuitions. I don't think most people have realist intuitions. Whether or not and to what extent people do have realist intuitions is an empirical question. At present, available empirical evidence does not support the claim that most people have realist intuitions. If anything, it may marginally lean towards suggesting that they don't. So, for those who may not have seen my content before, um, I'm, I'm a psychologist. I have a PhD in psychology. I wrote my dissertation specifically on the topic of whether or not most people are moral realists. The conclusion I came to after reviewing, as far as I could tell, nearly all the literature that exists on the topic, the answer I came to was probably not. We at the very least don't have good evidence. So, uh, what we do not have is definitive or even particularly strong evidence that most people are moral realists. What we likewise don't have is definitive evidence that they're not. We do have some suggestive evidence. There is, basically what you have is a very messy and inconclusive literature. I think overall, if I had to say where the evidence leaned, I would say it leans slightly towards there being more and being more prevalent in tested populations than realism. By the way, I got to ask, am I getting, I'm seeing my camera cut out. Am I pausing? Is it freezing up at all? Let me know in the chat because I really hope we are not returning to that issue that I had before where it was randomly freezing up and pausing. Do let me know. If it's just a camera issue on my end, then not a big deal. Anyway, what was I saying? Oh, right. So, I work on specifically on the topic of whether most people are realists or anti-realists. And yeah, okay. So I'm getting freezing. Damn. Okay, someone else saying no camera issues. All right. Well, I am pausing. So if you're listening, I am waiting because basically what I'm seeing is the camera is idling and then I'm waiting for it to go away. Anyway, for whatever reason, a lot of people will appeal to moral intuitions as the sort of first line of argument for moral realism and against anti-realism. And just I don't find it particularly good. Like whose moral intuitions? What if you don't have them? Now what? And so a lot of people might initially react to me, like let's say a realist goes, well, moral intuitions are one good reason to believe moral realism is true. And if I respond by saying, okay, but I don't have realist intuitions, like, okay, well then maybe there's something wrong with you. But it's like, oh, hold up. Okay. Why wouldn't we think maybe there's something wrong with you? Well, what if most people were like me and not like them? That's going to be a problem for them. And so really, I think if they want to lean so heavily on intuitions, the extent to which intuitions are widespread among the general public is kind of an important question to establish, and they just don't have the empirical basis for making that sort of claim. So when you see what a lot of realists will do is one, they'll appeal to various types of analyses of moral propositions, and they'll appeal to further like armchair intuitions about those. So they'll use basically armchair methods, the not empirical methods. I think those methods are I'll they're not good. They do not definitively establish that people speak or think like realists. You are not going to be able to establish claims about human psychology or linguistics by thinking about it. That's just not, these are empirical questions. They're not resolved by thinking about it. So you got to look at the empirical evidence. My blog has a bunch of blog posts where I've gone over the evidence for this. You could also look at some of my other work. I have papers on this. Well, at least one short paper, and then I have quite a bit of other work on this. But you could also check out the blog. That's where you're going to get the shortest, sort of fastest, like boom. Here's what the current state of the evidence shows. And so I'll give a very short history. So You had a few papers back from many years ago. One in 2003, Nichols and Folds Bennett, but things really got started with the empirical literature on whether people are realists or anti-realists, and with the 2008 paper, Goodwin and Darley. And what they found is people gave kind of mixed responses. They frame it as people being leaning more towards objectivism about morality, but reinterpretation, not just mine, but Thomas Bolster's as well, has questioned that. But the real issue is that a lot of that early research had pretty significant methodological shortcomings. And what that research tended to show is high rates of what at the time was called meta-ethical pluralism. So you could look at the paper by Jennifer Wright with colleagues Grandjean and McWhite, 2013 paper, where they attempted to correct for some issues in the Goodwin and Darley paper and still basically replicated the results, got very similar results. And so they upheld and affirmed moral meta-ethical pluralism, that people are realists about some moral issues and anti-realists about other moral issues. That would make those individuals realists. So a person would have to consistently be an anti-realist. It's pretty high bar to be an anti-realist. As long as you think there's one objective moral fact, you're a realist. So more recently, Thomas Polzer, working with Jennifer Wright, Thomas Polzer published some stuff talking about some of the methodological shortcomings in earlier research, and they worked together to devise new paradigms and new methods for measuring whether people are realists or anti-realists. At least in populations tested in the United States, they found predominantly anti-realist responses. There's a paper, I'm not sure if it's published, but it is available. I forget where I got it. I think it's ResearchGate or something. Pulsar did a collaborative work to do some cross-cultural research, and again found very high rates of anti-realism using more contemporary paradigms. And again, these are paradigms that were specifically designed in a variety of ways to correct for and to mitigate the confounds and methodological shortcomings of earlier research. And so what you're finding is, as the methods have improved, the anti-realist rates have gone up. Now, does that mean most people are anti-realist? No. You need a lot stronger, more robust empirical evidence. You would need I would want to see converging lines of evidence from multiple researchers or different labs. I'd want to see converging lines of evidence using different paradigms. And I would want to see better methods to establish the validity of the methods that were used. So there's a variety of things that you could raise as concerns about the existing research. In fact, I raise a lot of concerns about this research. I critique it fairly heavily. So at best, I think that existing research is inconclusive, with a slight leaning towards anti-realism being at least widespread among many populations, including the United States and the other populations that were tested by Pulsler and his collaborators. What we do not have are high quality methods and paradigms that like corrected for earlier problems and then find like universal realism. We just don't find that. So the notion that intuitions are going to favor realism, it doesn't fly. Okay. This is a good question. Clashman the Third says, Lance, do you have any plans on studying non-philosophers of intuitions about external reasons? I don't have plans, but it is on the list of things I would like to test. If someone takes up the idea and they do it before me, I'll be perfectly happy with that. There's plenty for me to run studies on and test. You could always do follow-up research. So if someone wants to collaborate, get in touch. This would be great research to do. Yeah, I think it's a great research question to ask if people believe in external reasons or normative reasons or however you want to frame them. It'd be really cool to see how non-philosophers think about reasons. It would be very difficult, but I think it'd be worth doing. All right, let's have a bit more look at the chat. I love how interactive y'all are. I really appreciate it. And again, I'll say for people that are popping in now, we hit 40 for active viewers. Merry Christmas, everybody. Happy holidays, whatever it is you're celebrating. I'm glad you're popping in here to celebrate it with me. Maybe people should be spending time with family, but hey, if you want to spend it with me, I'm kind of stuck at home. So, all right. All right. So regarding the camera thing, Andrea is saying that everything's running smoothly. Okay. Let's see. More comments. Thanks, everybody. And keep feeling free to throw comments in here. If I never get through the video, that's fine. We could always do more videos. Sailor says, I have a feeling the naturalist moral realism would be unpopular with the layman. If you ask most people, would morality be real without God? They'd say no. I don't know what they would say about that. And many of them might say no, for pretty bad reasons. And what I wouldn't want is so they might just think that. So it might be, yeah, lots of them would not find naturalism to be particularly favorable, but you could consider the counterfactual. What if they became an atheist and you gave them a couple months, then maybe they wouldn't have a problem with it. There is a new video on the Friction channel with David Kopp defending, well, talking about his new book on naturalist realism, and it's an attempt to square normativity issues. So naturalism often has the problem of maintaining, like, how do you account for normativity within a naturalist realist framework? And Kopp has a new book that purports to do that. So that's going to be interesting. I'm going to have to finish listening to the talk, which is good so far. That's it's a great channel, like much higher production quality than this channel, and interviews really serious scholars. So go check that out. If someone wants to throw a link to that in the chat, that'd be great too. But yeah, I don't know if it would be popular or not. It is the modal position, or the most common position among respondents to the 2020 Phil paper survey. It was like 30 something percent of people that took a meta ethical stance were naturalist realists, and it was about equal. It was 26.6% were non naturalist realists, and then 26.1% were anti realists. So it is a common position among analytic philosophers, even if it wouldn't be particularly popular among lay people. Oh, right. And Andre had said, do you have specific videos going into more depth about my views? That not really. It's kind of scattered all over the place. I'll that's the kind of thing where you could message me. It's hard for me to like stop and start pulling up videos and saying, oh, check out this, check out that. If you want to get in touch with me, I'd be happy to sort of go through, because I got like what 115 videos right now. Got 200 something blog posts. So if you're interested in specific uh, features of my views about things, I'd be happy to talk to you directly about them. I like to make time to talk to people, but if I already have stuff written or out there, it might make more sense for you to go listen to that. So other people could give you recommendations. You could throw a comment in the video afterwards, and I could respond there, or you could message me directly. My email's right on the page. So if you want to hear more about my views, I'd be happy to direct you to where you could hear more about them. But hard to do it in midstream to start pulling up links. So if other people want to, they're welcome to. But yeah, I do have stuff where I talk about that. I don't have any sort of like canonical place where I do that. I would like to do that, but I haven't done it yet. Oh, right. Hayden Walton says, I think the default would be that people think they are moral realists. I don't think so. Yeah, I don't even think that's true. So I not only do I not think people are moral realists, I don't even think that people think that they're moral realists. All right. And Sapir, I see, is making some recommendations to Andre. Thanks for doing that. All right. Oh yeah. Okay. Here, so Pierre's recommending my discussion with Michael Humer. I think that would be a good place to go, especially because you get a realist perspective, and one of the most highly respected and prolific moral realists out there. Humer is a non-naturalist realist. I do have a discussion with a, I don't know what mono. I don't know how to say his, because he has like a number in it from a while back, and he's a. I also have a discussion and maybe a video or two with James Fodor, who's also a naturalist realist. So I have talked to a few naturalists. I mostly talk to non-naturalists. So, so Femboy Origami says, if people have realist views on some issues and anti-realist views on other issues, maybe those views indicate something other than their metaphysical intuitions. Bingo. That's exactly what I think. I look at that and I think, do I find it plausible that people are actually realists about some things and anti-realists about others? No, I don't. And I'll point out actually something funny and interesting in the literature that hints at that suggestion. So basically, my conclusion about the literature is that the vast majority of respondents are not interpreting the questions in the way that researchers intend. So when a researcher is giving someone an instrument or an item or a tool, like they're using a paradigm, right? And the purpose of the paradigm, like you give a person a question or a scenario and they have to respond. The purpose from the researcher perspective is if they give one response that indicates they're a realist, if they give another response that indicates they're an anti-realist. You can complicate that. Maybe they have 6 responses, 3 of them are realist responses, 3 of them are anti-realist responses. It doesn't really matter. The point is, the purpose of the method that you're using is to sort the realists from the anti-realists in some consistent and reliable way. That's the purpose of the research. Now, that depends critically on the participants in your study interpreting the stimuli in the way that you intend. If I ask you one question and you interpret me as asking a different question, your response to that is no longer a valid indication. In other words, it's not an accurate indicator of your response to your position on the question I intended to ask. And so you have an issue here, which is that participants interpreting the questions in the way that the researchers intend is not an optional feature of the studies when it comes to the legitimacy or the validity of the study. So validity in this case refers to whether the study is measuring what it intends to measure. If the participants are not interpreting the questions as intended, it doesn't matter what pattern of responses they give, it's not a valid measure. And so what I think is that the respondents to these questions are not interpreting the questions as intended. At least most of them are not. And so what you have is an invalid measure. It's too noisy. If 80, 90% of people are not interpreting it as intended, good luck trying to sort out the 10% who do. Then you're going to have these like huge selection effects. It's just not, I think it's just the research has just not captured people's meta ethical views. So, if you're looking at this and people are giving this highly inconsistent view, it could be that people have really interesting hybrid meta-ethical views. It's possible. I think it's more plausible that they're not interpreting the questions as intended. So, is there evidence of this? Yes. So, I have quite a bit of evidence of this. I'm not going to get into all of it. You could see me on Joe Schmid's channel, Majesty of Reason, where I do actually talk about that empirical research at considerably greater length than I do in most other places. So that is one place where I have like a longer discussion on that specific evidence. Again, I would have to throw a link at people at this point because I've been doing this for a couple of years now. I have a video about this and a video about that, and so it's makes sense to just say go check out that video because I address it there. But I'll say a bit about this here. So, in fact, we'll do it as a poll for the audience. So let's do that. Let me create a poll, and I'm going to ask you a meta question. So I'm going to ask you a question about how other people answered a question. One moment. I have to set up the question. We're going to do a poll. Okay. Give me one moment to set up this question. It's going to take me a minute. In the meantime, throw questions in the chat if you got them. All right. All right. So I can't type out the full question. So you're going to have to listen to this part and then interpret the letters at the end of the question accordingly. Okay. So here's how I'm setting it up. Alex thinks Caesar drank wine on his 20th birthday. Sam disagrees. So Sam does not think Caesar drank wine on his 20th birthday. Can they both be right? And so your options are going to be both can be right, or at least one must be mistaken. Or I'll say, can they both be correct? Is it going to give me room for that? Yes. Both can be correct, be incorrect. We'll just use very precise language here. All right. Now, here's what's critical. I don't want to know what your response to that question is. I wrote after that WDMPS. So the question is, what do most people say? So what I'm asking you when you choose your response, what do most people say when they were given this question? Did most people say that both can be correct, or did most people say at least one must be correct? All right. I know that's a little complicated, but let's see what we get with it. Try to make things interactive, right? So how did most respondents to this question respond? Did most respondents say that both can be correct, or did most respondents say that at least one of them must be incorrect? So in other words, so two people disagree. One says, "Hey, I think Julius Caesar drank wine on his 20th birthday," and then the other person, Sam, says, "No, I don't think so. I don't think Caesar drank wine on his 20th birthday." And then, I say, hey, do you think Alex and Sam can both be correct, or do you think at least one of them has to be incorrect? So a question like this was given to participants in studies, and I want to know what you think. Did most people say that they could both be correct, or that at least one of them has to be incorrect? Okay, so I'm going to take a quick break, and I will be right back. I have to get a drink. I'm getting super thirsty. So I will be back in a couple minutes. Please answer that poll, and then I'll address how that relates to Femboy Origami's question. I'll be right back in a couple minutes. All right, I am back. Uh, oh, did I leave the camera on? So I just had this like empty. Okay. Anyway, I am back. Okay, so let's see how people voted. We're gonna end the poll. How many votes did we get? Only 14 votes. Okay, so let's have a look. So it looks like about 80% of you chose at least one must be incorrect, and only about 1 in 5 of you chose both can be correct. The actual number was about 50-50. So people were about evenly split on judging whether a historical event, whether if two people disagree about a historical event, they could both be correct or not. So if that question was interpreted as intended, what it would mean to say that Julius Caesar, like two people disagree about Caesar drinking wine on his 20th birthday, what that would seem to indicate is, I think an actual story is 21st birthday, whatever, doesn't matter. So what that would seem to indicate, if you think both people could be correct, is that you're a relativist about historical events. So you think that a particular historical event both did and did not happen, and that whether it happened or not is a matter of preference. So if I preferred that Caesar drank wine, then he did, and if you prefer that he didn't, then he didn't. That would be a profoundly weird position to take for people to be relativists about historical events. And so, would that research show that half of the participants are relativists about historical events? I don't think so. I think that something else is going on. And so, if something else is going on for that question, maybe we should be suspicious of the rest of the questions, because the primary tool used to assess whether people are realists or anti realists about morality is this disagreement paradigm. And, if you get these sorts of answers that it seems really implausible that people be relativist about historical events, maybe there's an issue there. Now, the other thing is that the quote unquote relativist rates, the anti-realist rates of people saying both could be correct, go up the more the issue, even if it's like a factual dispute, is controversial. So if it's a question about the Earth being flat, you might get a very high rate of people saying at least one person is incorrect. But if it's a question about, I don't know, climate change or something like that, the number is going to go up. And if it's a super contentious or ambiguous claim, then the number is going to go up even further. Now, whether or not there's a fact of the matter that's independent of people's preferences or attitudes shouldn't really turn on whether the issue is one that's uncertain or controversial. Was there life on Mars? Yeah, I don't know if there was life on Mars or not, but there's the fact of the matter about it doesn't depend on our preferences. So, but you would probably get a pretty high anti-realist response rate to that, or relativist response rate to that, if you gave that question. Like Alex thinks there was life on Mars, Sam thinks there wasn't. So this indicates that at least for certain kinds of questions in using this paradigm, people probably aren't interpreting them in the way that researchers intend, and I think this probably does generalize. Okay. Root beer guy says, "I like the red logo." Yeah, I got a Christmas logo, so I got super Christmas themed here. Hayden Walton says, "Xmas was yesterday." I don't know where you are. It's technically Christmas here, but I've got a lot of Brazilian family, so we celebrate on Christmas Eve. But I also have my American side, so we've got Christmas Eve and Christmas, so we get a double Christmas. Stephen Thomas says, "We are your family this Christmas." Oh, that's nice of you to say. All right. So Blevlin says, "Merry Christmas, like the stream, everyone." I can approve of that. Yeah, do like the stream. Yeah, like the video. Give me a thumbs up. And subscribe if you're not subscribed. Hannah says, "I'm an atheist and I will not recognize this Christmas of yours." Yes, I'm a Grinch, dude. I'm not a Grinch. I'm a very grumpy person, but I'm not a Grinch. Mason says, "My family got sick and we had to cancel our holiday plans. Everyone's recovering. Okay. Well, I'm glad they're recovering. Okay. Yeah, I was sick last Christmas, but we all we all hung out anyway and nobody else got sick. So it was at the tail end of it. So it was just kind of like coughing at the end. But my last Christmas, you might have for those of you that have been around a long time, I wasn't doing videos because I wasn't here. I was in Brazil. I was doing some TikToks, but because I could do those, so I was just doing them in like random places. But I wasn't able to do full streams. I didn't have a setup to. I actually recorded a couple videos while I was there. Oh right, Woodabooms. Incorrect. Yeah, the people commenting on the poll. All right. Andre says, "Do you know Lance's position on normative ethics?" I could just answer that. I don't have a position on normative ethics. I like to say now I'm a retired utilitarian. I used to be a classical utilitarian, so that'd be like an hedonic act utilitarian. And I kind of just stopped having I stopped advocating that there is a like a correct normative moral theory or endorsing a normative moral theory. Now I act based on my goal standards and values, but not in a way that is like systematic or principled. So my principle is that I don't have principles. If that maybe people find that really objectionable. Oh, right. Yeah, so Hannah says Sam and Alex may think about different Caesars. Right. So that's the kind of thing that people will say if you ask them, how did you interpret the question, or why do you think people might disagree with one another? And that also applies to how they react if you give them moral questions. So, you could say, hey, Alex thinks it's wrong to steal, Sam thinks it's not wrong to steal. Do you think they could both be correct? Or must at least one of them be incorrect? And some people will say they could both be correct. And if you say why? Why do you give that answer? They'll say, well, maybe Alex is thinking of stealing in one situation, and Sam is thinking of stealing another situation, and it's okay in one case, and it's not okay in the other. And so in that case, they don't really disagree with one another. People are interpreting the question in an unintended way. It's implicit in the presumptions behind the intended interpretation that people understand the disagreement to concern the same scenario, or it to be conveyed in abstract terms where there isn't like this case versus that case. So it's intended to bracket that off, but that's not how people or at least some people don't interpret it that way. And they do think that the people might be thinking of different scenarios. So yeah, one of the most telling was a participant saying if when two people disagreed about some really horrible thing, like one person thought the horrible thing was wrong, and then another person is like, no, I don't think it's wrong. And they were asked why they think that people disagree. They were like, oh, the second person misunderstood the question, which is a perfectly reasonable response. This is why when I talk about people's interpretations of these questions, I call them unintended interpretations. I do think misinterpretation is an okay term to use when talking to someone in certain contexts, but when it comes to participants in a study, misinterpretation implies that they're making some kind of foreseeable error, and it's due to their like lack of knowledge. Now, they may not be knowledgeable about what researchers intend, but that's kind of the researcher's responsibility. So these are unintended interpretations, but they're often completely reasonable interpretations that are like a totally sensible way for people to think. And I think basically people that don't have training in philosophy have highly sophisticated context sensitive ways of interpreting questions, and they're impressive. So when a person says, yeah, the other person misunderstood the question, completely reasonable answer, but it suggests that the person did not interpret the question as intended. They weren't interpreting the question as like, hey, just imagine there really were two people that disagree and one of them really thinks this thing you think is really they think it's morally okay. Just imagine that. And they just don't. They're like, well, it's more plausible that a person wouldn't think that. So if they gave this answer, maybe they misunderstood the question. Again, totally reasonable, but not actually what was needed for the measure to be valid for that participant. Hayden says, did you mean at least one incorrect? Yeah. So I messed up the survey. Sorry, I was trying to fit everything into the goofy little there's like limits, and I guess I just edited it incorrectly. At least I said edited it without messing up, but I messed up the poll. Yeah, so maybe the poll's not particularly diagnostic. Oh well. It says these results are fabricated. Talk about corruption and data fudging. Well, and then there's also a typo in it, and it's kind of an important typo. So yeah, we will discard the results of that survey. All right. We've only got about 8 minutes in the video. It's been an hour and a half. That's pretty typical for this for me on this channel. Okay, let's keep going. And thanks for the correction, Hayden, and whoever else that spotted it. Oh, one moment. Where is the actual video? Oh, here it is. Okay. I started playing this stream as if that was going to continue the video, and it does not. That's funny. Okay. One moment. Let's go back to the video. Yeah. Okay.
Own understanding and my understanding, which is the same. And this is a weird argument, I realize, because on one hand, it's very weak in that I can't provide.
It was so long ago, I lost track of where he's at. So let's start over.
My first piece of evidence for objective morality that I would present is
all right,
your own moral intuition. I mean, your own understanding and my understanding, which is the same.
See, it's the same. So he has realist intuitions, and whoever you are, you have moral intuitions, and they're the same. So if he has realist intuitions, you have realist intuitions. Again, just assuming that his audience has the same, that has realist intuitions. It's an empirical question. He's not entitled to that presumption.
And this is a weird argument, I realize, because on one hand, it's very weak in that I can't
Yes,
provide tangible proof of it, because I'm telling you what's going on in your own head, which I can't prove, and of course comes off extremely presumptuous.
Yes, at least he's very self-aware of how presumptuous this is. He's telling you it's in his head, and he's like, "Well, I understand it's weak. I understand it's presumptuous. Right on. I wish academic philosophers would acknowledge the same, that when they go around saying, we think this way, you think this way, that they are being presumptuous and that it's a very tentative claim. They're welcome to tell us what they think and what's going on in their heads. But at least he's aware that it's pretty presumptuous to tell other people what's going on in their heads.
On the other hand, it's a strong argument because as you listen to it, you know that what I'm saying is true.
Yeah. Okay. So, but I don't though, and I don't have I don't have realist intuitions, and I don't think most people have realist intuitions. And if you disagree, I'd be happy to discuss the evidence. Well,
So here's the point. Each person who says that morality is not objective, in fact, I'll personalize this. You who are listening to this right now, if you as an individual, if you believe that morality is relative, if that's what you claim to believe anyway, then I'll talk to you. So you say that maybe you laugh at the idea of objective morality. We all have our own morality.
to laugh at it. Do we laugh at the idea of objective morality? Let me ask that in the chat. Maybe I won't mess up this question. Do you laugh at the idea of objective morality? Okay, so we have a new poll, which is, do you laugh at the idea of objective morality? Let's find out. All right, and we can continue the video in the meantime.
My morality is not your morality, so on and so forth. Yet you say that. Yet I know that you know that rape is wrong.
So this is, again, the conflation between first order claims and second order claims. There's also normative entanglement here. So, he knows that things are wrong. So you could think things are wrong if you're relativist. It's consistent with relativism to think things are wrong for pretty much the same reason that it's consistent with relativism about food preferences to think food can taste good or bad.
You know that murder is wrong. You know that it's wrong to tell a lie.
Yeah. So lying and murder and, all the terrible things, I don't like repeating some of the things that people say. Those are all horrible things. Well, I mean, stealing, there might be circumstances where stealing is okay. But it's completely consistent with being an anti-realist to think these things are wrong and to completely condemn them with the same fervor and force as any moral realist. So if you're a realist, you might just think, yeah, there's some fact, that provided by God or the universe or whatever, according to which these things are wrong. And what does that make them more wrong somehow? So, what would someone that does think things are objectively wrong? So they think, let's take murder or stealing. If you think these things are objectively wrong, okay, now it turns out there is no God, and you thought God was needed for these things to be objectively wrong. So now what? So now you're not against murder. You're not against stealing. I'm against stealing and murder, even if there's no objective moral truth. So are you? Because if you are against them, even if there is no objective moral truth, uh, what do you need the objective moral truth for? What is it? What is that doing something extra? Would you be less concerned about someone like beating children to death? If objective morality wasn't true, because I'm not any less concerned about it. I'm equally as concerned whether there's objective moral truth or not. So if the objective moral truth happens to align with my values, great, fortunate coincidence. If it doesn't, to hell with the objective moral truth. Because if the objective moral truth doesn't say it's morally wrong to beat someone to death or torture people for fun, then to hell with the moral facts. I'm going to be against those things anyway. So it's real weird that moral realists act like there's some advantage. There's something better about moral objectivism being true. What's better about it? Why is that better? What do we need it for? I don't think it does any work at all. It's at best superfluous. At worst, it's actively at odds with what we value. I think people generally act on their own goals and motivations, their own values. I say generally as a hedge. I really think that's the, personally, I think that's the, I don't even know how, what else you would do other than act on your own values. Maybe you value complying with the objective moral truth, whatever they happen to be. I don't. And so if the objective moral truths align with my values, good, then I'll comply, but not because they're objective. And if they don't, I'm not going to comply. I'm not interested in that. And I don't know why anyone would be any different. Would realists be any different than that? If so, why? Why would you conform to rules that violate your own values? Why would you do that? In other words, it seems to me like uh, moral realism, even if it were true, would be functionally subordinate to anti-realist perspectives anyway. If there were any objective moral truths, we would only comply with them if they conform with our subjective moral values. If they didn't, why would we comply with them? If you genuinely feel or think on subjective grounds something is wrong, and then someone says, but it turns out objectively it's right, would you go, oh, well, I guess I'm mistaken, I'll go do that, I'll go do that then? Because I think my reaction would be, well, I guess I'll be evil. If it's evil to not torture babies for fun, then I will happily embrace being evil, and be a non-baby torturer. So I think realists are real weird about this stuff. I think externalizing morality makes very little sense. And I don't know why they are so confident that there's a presumption in favor of it. I think it's one of the weirdest ideas that there is. Yeah. So Mason says this conflating of normative ethics and meta ethics seems to be the most common fallacy I've seen from realists. It's like they just cannot get the two separate. You can think things are wrong and not be a realist. Again, do you think food is good or bad? Then and are you a realist about that? No. Well, if not, then you can think things can be good or bad without being a realist. I don't what the hell is up with realists thinking you can't think otherwise than to think things are only actually good or bad if realism is true. Again, I can point to examples that are probably true of realists themselves where they don't think this. So weird. Right. Oh, let's have a look at the poll actually. All right, we only got 15 votes. So we'll see if we get more votes. Oh wow, I dropped down to 24 people. I was at 40 at some point. Maybe the break really took it out of people. All right, let's
Now,
keep going.
maybe you've told lies in the past, but you knew it was wrong when you did it. And so you felt guilty for it afterwards.
Yeah, so feeling guilty, believing things are right or wrong, completely consistent with anti-realism. Oh well, if he says, "Hey, you can claim you're relativist, but you think things are wrong," what? If you're relativist, of course you think things are wrong. You think they're right or wrong relative to your standards or values, or the standards or values of your culture. It's not the view that you don't think things are right or wrong. I mean, how many? It's like an onion of mistakes. So he makes the mistake of thinking relativists don't think anything is right or wrong when they very explicitly do think things are right or wrong. And then he makes the mistake of thinking that if they think anything is right or wrong, that they think it's right or wrong in the realist sense when he hasn't established that. Like, hey, I know you think things are stance independently wrong. How do I know that? You think things are wrong. What the hell? So, hey, I know you think some food is stance independently tasty. Why? Because you say food is tasty. That doesn't follow. It just doesn't follow. Does he not know between a person judging something to be right or wrong and them judging it to be stance independently right or wrong? There is a difference. Oh, it's so frustrating. It's so frustrating because he's here chastising atheists for making mistakes, and he's right about the chastisements of atheists. They do make the mistakes, and then he just has this litany of errors and misunderstandings of anti-realist positions.
And there are plenty of people out there, unfortunately, who have murdered and raped. But unless they were insane, they knew it was wrong when they did it.
Again, wrong or stance independently or objectively wrong, to use the terminology a lot of people like to use. There's a difference between thinking something is wrong and thinking it's objectively wrong. Showing that people think things are wrong does not establish that they think it's objectively wrong. I've made that point enough times, but it's very frustrating to keep hearing this.
Which is why we can justify putting them in prison, because they knew it was wrong and they did it. If they didn't know it was wrong and they did it, then they go to an insane asylum. So you know it. And when I say you know it, I mean you know it. Not that you've decided it or that it's your preference, but that it's a thing. It's a reality that you know and that you recognize. Okay?
an objective or stance independent one? Say it. If you think that, say it. But he's not saying it. It's unclear. Does he mean that they think it stands independently right or wrong? If he does think that, I mean, one, now he's implying that unless you're a moral realist, you're a psychopath, which is ridiculous. And it's just not true. And he like if he's saying that, but he's not being explicit, which is frustrating. So it's frustrating that he's not being explicit. I think he's suggesting that everyone knows things are stance independently right or wrong. If he thinks that, where's the evidence for that? Because I don't think that that's true, and I don't think he's got the evidence that would suggest that that's true. And you might say, "Oh, well, do you have evidence that it's not true?" Yes, yes, I do. I actually do. So we do have that. I mean, there is an asymmetry here.
So how do I know that you know it? Well, because if I
Okay, great. So now we're going to hear how he knows that you know. So if he's claiming he knows that his audience are a bunch of moral realists, I guess, except psychopaths or something. Now he's going to tell us how he knows that that's true. But again, he hasn't been explicit enough, so it's still not entirely clear. Yeah. So Sapir says, yeah, remember back like a year ago, I had an intermittent connection issue, and then I moved, and um, I have a different camera, I have a different microphone, I have a different computer. Everything is. I have a different internet connection. Everything is different. So I don't know what's going on, and we'll have to sort out what the issue is again. Let me close some windows. Maybe it's just slow from having too much stuff open. I don't know. I'll check my connection speed too. Let's check it. It's going to be fast, so I don't know what the issue is. We'll get back to it. Let me close the poll. All right. So what's our current poll look like? It's not showing me the final results. I hit in poll. Show me those results. Okay, so slightly more than half of you favored out of 19 votes. Do you laugh at the idea of objective morality? And then about half of you said no. So yeah, it looks like people are about evenly split here. So do we laugh at objective morality? Yeah, some of us do, some of us don't. Pretty even split here. Yeah. So regarding the technical stuff, yeah, I saw some brief stutters earlier. They're different from the stutters from when before you moved, though. I agree. So they're not the same thing, whatever they are. They might have the same cause, but I don't know. I don't think so. Yeah, we'll figure it out. This time I'm not going to let stutters happen for a year. Okay. Let's keep going with the video. Oh, and let me check my speed test. Oh yeah. Yeah, there's no way. It's not the speed. Okay.
I murdered someone or if I stole from someone, you would not say, well, that was, that's your opinion. That's your morality. I mean, that's what you thought was right. And so,
Yeah, but if you're relativist, you wouldn't have to respond that way. So if you're relativist, if you're an appraiser relativist, you would judge people according to your standards. And so you wouldn't go, well, because you thought it's okay to do that, then it's okay. No, you go, I'm against you doing that. So it's not okay for you to do that. That's maybe the most standard type of relativism. You do not have to be an agent relativist. You don't have to judge people by their standards as a relativist. You could judge them by your standards.
So I'm not going to judge you. No, you wouldn't do that, would you? You would condemn my actions. And
yep, totally consistent with anti-realism and relativism. It's just completely consistent to do so. Again, I think it's hinting at this notion that relativism has to be agent relativism, not appraiser relativism, and that's not true. I mean, good lord, good lord. Why is it that it's just an onion of misunderstandings and misrepresentations? So the mistaken view that relativism means there can't be moral truth, the mistaken view that you can't. So I mean, look, let's go through the problems. You can't have moral realism without God. Wrong. If you're an atheist or you're stuck with your moral anti-realism, your only option is relativism. Wrong. Failure to distinguish between different types of relativism. Can't say that it's wrong, but there's something, it's not right. So that's a problem. Thinking relativism means that there's no moral truth. Wrong. Thinking relativism specifically means agent relativism. Wrong. It's just wrong, 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 wrong. And it's just it's such a like all the wrongs are nested inside the other. So you have this like this like Russian doll of wrongness where every wrong thing is nested inside another wrong thing until it's just an endless series of wrong things wrapped inside of wrong things. And then this is what we get as far as criticism of anti-realist positions, is that people are just fundamentally incapable of accurately representing what the position even is, and then they're criticizing it based on a bunch of misunderstandings, misrepresentations, and falsehoods. And I don't even think any of it's intentional. I think people just genuinely don't understand the view. Like, I don't think he's intentionally going, ha ha ha, I'm going to smear relativism. I think he doesn't understand the position. And I heard someone recently say, one of the things people sometimes do is they'll say that there's no way a person could, um, reject a position and understand it. They would have to, so it must be a misunderstanding. I'm not saying that. You could understand it and reject it. I understand it and reject it. I'm not a relativist. But like, geez, why can't anybody accurately represent it before criticizing it? My God. Why is it so many mistakes that compound one another to where, like, what he's describing here is so far from an accurate representation of relativism. It's just ludicrous. It's not even close. Yeah. So, Finboy Origami, I'm assuming this is sarcasm. I'm shocked that Matt Walsh doesn't know the distinction between agent and appraiser relativism. Well, the thing is, if you are going to make a video about it, I would expect someone to like do a little bit of homework, and it wouldn't be that difficult to go on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and look at moral relativism. Look at it there. I mean, it has a section right there. I'll show it to y'all. Why not? Let's do it. Let's have a look. Boom. Here we go. Look, everybody, I will read the section here to you. Is this it? Here it is. Okay. Here is the relevant section. Okay. So the section says, third, that to which truth or justification is relative may be the persons making the moral judgments or the persons about whom the judgments are made. These are sometimes called appraiser and agent relativism, respectively. Appraiser relativism suggests that we do or should make moral judgments on the basis of our own moral standards, while agent relativism implies that the relevant standards are those of the persons we are judging. Of course, in some cases, these may coincide. Appraiser relativism is the more common position, and it will usually be assumed in the discussion that follows. So it's right in the Stanford Encyclopedia entry of philosophy on moral relativism. I don't pull these distinctions out of thin air. They come from the actual literature on the topic. Now, I don't see a citation or evidence that appraiser relativism is in fact the more common of the two. Maybe agent relativism is more common, but there are two distinct forms of relativism. They have very important differences in terms of their implications. An appraiser relativist does not have to be okay with another person doing whatever they want. They don't have to be okay with other cultures doing whatever they want. Only agent relativism arguably would commit you to that sort of, it's questionable whether it does, but appraiser relativism just does not. It just doesn't have that implication. And so just time after time after time, critics, whether professional or non-professional, criticizing relativism only focus on agent relativism as if appraiser relativism doesn't exist. And I think it's because they're not aware that it exists. But it is very convenient that they focus on the type of relativism that is subject to this type of criticism, that it's easy to make it look bad, because it's a lot harder to make appraiser relativism look bad, because it doesn't carry that implication that you can't care about other people's standards or values. So it's real frustrating that people could learn about these topics, and it wouldn't take a ton of effort. I'm not saying that, he's got to go read everything in contemporary metaethics and become a professional philosopher, but like, talk to a couple people, and he certainly has the resources to consult experts, and I'm sure they'd be happy to talk to him. So, this just consistent failure of people to actually engage with the distinction between agent and appraiser relativism is really frustrating. And I think it's legitimate for me to be bothered by it. You know, um, a lot of other people in a lot of other fields would say, "Hey, you're not drawing a distinction between A and B. Your objection applies to B, not to A, and you're just saying that the whole thing is wrong." For comparison, imagine I came up with some, or not came up with. Imagine I pointed to some particular Christian denomination that had severe problems, like logical issues. So let's say they endorsed logically contradictory positions, and then I said, "Look, Christianity's wrong because this Christian sect over here has a contradictory position." I think other Christians would quickly and rightly point out, "Yeah, that's applicable to their theology, but not ours." Right? Okay, and so criticism of agent relativism applies to agent relativism, not appraiser relativism. So if you want to reject relativism, which one are you rejecting? Because if you're only rejecting agent relativism, you still got appraiser relativism to contend with, and the objections that people raise against agent relativism frequently don't apply to appraiser relativism. So it's the same thing, and it's real weird for people to ignore the distinction. The distinction matters. All right. All right. I removed that one. There we go. DJ Bambarino says, "Yeah, I like to say recursively incorrect." Baba Ali says, "Fractal wrongness." Sapir says, "I have a feeling that if I said what he says I wouldn't say, he would then say that I'm lying or something." Yeah, I don't know what he would say. So, I would not. I don't affirm realism, and I do wonder what he would say to a consistent anti-realist like me. Um, I'm not sure. Okay. Fanboy Origami getting very sarcastic in the comments. DJ Bimmerino, it's possibly doesn't know that the SCP exists. Well, I hope he hears about it, and we'll check it out at least for if he's going to do commentary on certain topics. That does a little bit of research. I'm assuming they have it like a team, so there could probably be quite a few people that could do research. And these days, you got a lot of easy ways to summarize things, so it's pretty easy to get information these days. Me Cell says, "How many philosophers you talk to know the difference?" Good question. I don't know how many know the difference. When I brought it up with professional philosophers on a few occasions, they were aware of the difference. Uh, so it's I don't, but it might be that I'm talking to people specifically because they're in my kind of orbit, and so they're more likely to do meta ethics or be aware of it. So if you surveyed random philosophers, would they be aware of it? I don't know. I mean, there's probably a ton of distinctions in various areas of philosophy that I don't know anything about. So people can whip out distinctions in epistemology and stuff. I'm going to go, I don't know. And there's going to be a lot of stuff like metaphysics I don't know anything about. So yeah, a lot of us don't know about a lot of stuff in a lot of other areas. I know a lot of stuff at the intersection of philosophy and psychology, so like experimental philosophy type stuff. But there's a lot of distinctions I don't know about. So I don't know if most of them know the distinction. But it's a good question. I would like to know the answer to that. Sapir says, "Lance, if you consider that he could easily find people which appear to count as experts, it would still use phrasing and rhetoric more or less consistent with what Walsh says here." Yeah, unfortunately, I think it's quite common for people, even with training in these fields, to not do a great job of charitably and accurately representing anti-realism. So someone says you assume way too much good faith from Walsh. I'm not assuming anything one way or another. I'm trying to just take the claims as they are. I'm reluctant to assume bad faith from people. I think a lot of people are very quick to assume bad faith. I'm not assuming good faith. I'm just taking the claims as they are.
You would condemn them with force and intensity because I broke a code that you think I ought to have followed, which means that you innately recognize the code and you believe that I recognize it, which means that you believe it to be objective.
Nope, that doesn't follow. So if I want you to do something, so if I'm upset with you, that doesn't require me to think that, let's take back the specific claims. Look,
To judge you. No, you wouldn't do that, would you? You would condemn my actions and you would condemn them with force and intensity.
So condemning with force and intensity does not require that you presuppose that the other person recognizes, awares, or is aware of, or agrees with you about the actions in question. If there were a horrible person, let's say a person was out torturing people, and you explain your view, "Hey, I think that what you're doing is wrong, blah blah blah." They could say, "I understand that you think that. I don't agree with you. I think what I'm doing is good, and I'm going to keep doing it." I wouldn't go, oh, well, in that case, that's fine then. I would still stop them because I don't want them to do it. All that's needed to condemn someone for doing something you don't like is that you don't like it. That's it. That's enough. It's enough for me. Again, if there were no objective moral truths, I already don't think that there are. But if you're a realist and you think there's no objective moral truths, like you become an anti-realist, do you stop caring if people are torturing other people? I sure hope not. You'd probably go, well, yeah, okay, so it's not objectively wrong, but I'm against it. So don't do that. I'm going to stop you if you try. That's the position I'm already in. I don't care whether there's objective moral truths. I don't want people torturing other people. And I don't care whether they recognize that it's right or wrong to torture people on my view. I don't care whether they believe it. I don't care whether they feel it. I don't want them torturing people. I don't need them to recognize that or believe it or think it. I don't need there to be facts to not want them to do it. Why would I need any of that? Why would I have to assume any of that? The simple answer is I don't need it and I don't have to assume that. And I see no reason to think that when people go out morally judging others, that they're operating on these implicit presumption of moral realism or that other people recognize or share their attitudes or values. They don't need any of that to condemn other people. None of what he's proposing here is necessary at all. Completely superfluous, totally unnecessary. You do not need any of it. You can simply be against people doing stuff you don't like. That is all that you need to be against people doing stuff you don't like. You don't need anything else.
Because I broke a code that you think I ought to have followed.
Right. So if you break a code, I think you ought to follow. That's all I need to condemn you. I just don't want you to do the thing. Now, watch what he says here.
Which means that you innately recognize the code and
which means you innately recognize the code. No. So I can be against people torturing people. I don't have to innately recognize that torture is wrong. I could come to that conclusion. For whatever reason I think is wrong, and whatever the reason might be, but it doesn't have to be innate. And again, it's unclear what he means by innate, but I don't have to be endowed by God or it be a product of evolution. It could be something I learned. I could learn over the course of my life to regard something as wrong. Like given my values and given my attitudes and given the information and experiences that I've had, I could come to acquire an attitude or belief about what's right or wrong. It doesn't have to be innate. So that's not true.
You believe that I recognize it, which means
you don't have to believe that they recognize it. So like when we run across serial killers and psychopaths, do we think that they recognize what's right or wrong? No, still lock them up in prison. So, I don't particularly care whether they recognize something is right or wrong. Now, if a person is completely out of touch with reality or they lack empathy or there's something wrong with their brain, that might be some type of mitigating factor under some circumstances for how we end up treating that person. It's really going to depend. I'm not okay with psychopaths going out and like harming people. I'm not going to go, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize you're a psychopath. I guess it's okay. Nope, still against it. There's a big difference though between a person that is completely out of touch with reality and is harming people. Maybe they got drugged against their will and they're hallucinating and they think everybody around them is a demon. That's a very different situation if they're harming people than someone that's hurting other people because they're a sadist. Those are different. They're both bad. But in none of those cases does being opposed to other people require, like other people's actions, require that you think that those people recognize or share with you the belief that the actions and questions are right or wrong. It just doesn't require that. And I see no reason to presume that people are implicitly operating with that principle in mind.
Means that you believe it to be objective.
Nope, it doesn't mean that. That's the worst part of this. Let's take it back again.
You think I ought to have followed, which means that you innately recognize the code and you believe that I recognize it, which means that you believe it to be objective.
So first of all, even if let's say I have a moral value, like I think private property rights should be respected up to a point or something like that. Or you shouldn't just take people's stuff without their consent, unless there's a very good reason to do so. Okay, so let's say I think that, and I think other people think that. Okay, first of all, that doesn't mean that I think that I or they think that it stands independently right or wrong. Like I don't, just because I think, yeah, I think this is bad and I think other people think this is bad, that doesn't require me to think that I think it stands independently bad or that other people think it stands independently bad. It doesn't require that. Nor does it follow that if I think that you think something that I think, that therefore I think it follows that like I have to think that it stands independently the case. In other words, even if you operate on the assumption that your values are shared by other people, it doesn't follow that you therefore think that those values are stands independently, right or wrong, just because you think they're shared by other people. Compared to things like food, I think other people like their food to be savory and sweet. They don't like their food to be, like we could get into describing like to taste like rotting garbage or feces or something. I think that's generally true of almost everybody, that they like certain, there's like a lot of overlap in people's food preferences. So when I say this food is bad, I don't just mean it's bad to me. Like, let's say a food was like prepared really poorly in a kitchen. I'm appealing to intersubject. Chefs have to make these judgments all the time. It's not like a chef in a kitchen is just absolutely like only judging whether food is good or bad based on their own taste preferences. There could be a chef that like doesn't like cinnamon or dislikes chocolate or is allergic to strawberries, and they could still prepare food for other people. And they could say this food is good, this food is bad, based on assumptions about what other kinds of food other people are likely to like on average. They make assumptions about general human taste preferences. None of that requires that they assume that there are stance independent facts or that objective facts about what food is good or bad. It doesn't require that. So me thinking I think this is right or wrong, morally speaking, and I think you think this is morally right or wrong, does not require me to think that therefore it stands independently right or wrong. That just doesn't follow. So again, we could add to the Russian doll case a couple more Russian dolls here. One, thinking something, having an innate disposition. Sorry, thinking something is right or wrong doesn't mean you think it innately. You could have acquired it culturally, so that's wrong. Me thinking that you share my attitudes doesn't mean that I'm a realist about it, so that's wrong. And then, the fact that it's shared between us. So if I infer that you share my values, that doesn't entail realism. And the fact that people have the same values, that doesn't entail realism. So I don't know if I really want to draw a sharp distinction there. Maybe we could say that that's one Russian doll, and then the notion about innateness, another Russian doll. So the Russian dolls just keep growing here.
That is not subject to opinion. Another example. You condemn the Nazi, even though you're a moral relativist, you still condemn the Nazi Holocaust. And if I launched a serious argument where I said that the Nazis, the Nazis, they thought that what they were doing was okay. And I mean, they had their reasons for it. And hey, let's not foist our morality on them. If I made that argument, you would react rightly with disgust and derision. You would mock me.
Yeah, if you're an appraiser relativist, that would be a completely reasonable response. It's completely consistent with appraiser relativism. So again, is he criticizing relativism or agent relativism?
You would spit at me for making that argument. Because again, you recognize that the Nazis broke a universal code and that
you don't have to think that they broke any kind of stance independent code. You could think that what they did is repugnant, horrific, and awful and horrible. And you don't have to think that there has to be an objective truth about that for you to think it's repugnant and horrible and awful. What if there's no God? And we can't have the kind of realism that Matt believes in. Okay, then we just don't care about the Holocaust, because I'd still care about the Holocaust, whether God exists or not. I would still think it was horrible and awful and terrible and bad. Again, you do not need realism to condemn things. This is so weird. Why would you need realism to condemn things? What we're not getting is an argument for why you would need to. Is just making assumptions. It's just, hey, I know you think things are bad, and so you think they're objectively bad. Nope, doesn't follow. The fact that you know that your audience is mostly going to think that certain bad things are bad does not mean that they must therefore think that they're objectively bad. That simply doesn't follow. This is a baseless claim.
In justifying their behavior, in denying that code, which in this context you see correctly as a plainly absurd thing to do. So even though you claim to be a moral relativist, if I made a consistent morally relativistic argument in relation to the Nazi Holocaust or rape, you would laugh at me. You would laugh at your own position if it was made to you in reference to one of these things. So that is my first argument. I know
that's his first argument. It's not a good argument. So there's just a whole bunch of misunderstandings, conflations, failures to draw distinctions, just totally misconstrues anti-realism, uses stuff like really and actually in misleading ways. I don't think any of this necessarily has to be intentional. A lot of people are quick to make judgments about saying, oh, everybody's good faith, bad faith. I think he just doesn't understand meta ethics.
That morality is objective because I can see that it is, and you
could see that it is, literally or metaphorically, because I don't think you could see in a literal sense. So is it metaphorical sense? So he metaphorically sees it. Okay, well, I metaphorically see that it's not the case. Now what?
Who can see that it is? And
yes, he's telling his audience what they see. So this is a really frustrating way to argue. It's just, imagine I just did a video where I said, look, I'm right about stuff, and I know that you know that I'm right about stuff. You agree with me. You agree with me. Hey, you people listening right now, you agree with me. That's his argument. His argument is you agree with me. That's not a, that's a crap argument. If like, come on, let's be real here. If you want to show your audience agrees with you, okay, do a survey, do a poll, and then we'll see. We could see how representative your audience is of people in general. Let's see if people agree with you. Of course, we'd want to test the validity of the studies and see if they're consistent with other studies. But just insisting everybody agrees with you, just presuming that they do. I mean, he noted at the outset there's a presumption. So his argument is, I presume that you agree with me. Okay, so then you're all wrong together. Even if that were the case, hey, just saying your audience agrees with you isn't a good indicator that the claim in question is true. Like, I could imagine a flat earther goes to the flat earth annual conference and says, you agree with me that the earth is flat. And they're like, yeah, we do. Okay. Does that mean the earth is flat? Nope. So one, I think it's probably not true that most people agree with him. And two, even if they did, that's not a particularly strong argument for thinking that it's true. You'd need to have some argument for why we should trust moral intuitions, and then some reason to think that most people have these intuitions and blah, blah, blah. Maybe deal with some defeaters from critics. But he's not doing that. So kind of, this is not going to get us very far.
Everyone can see that it is. And if something was truly subjective, then there is simply no way that we would all have exactly the same sense of it.
That doesn't follow either. Add it to the Russian doll. If it was subjective, we wouldn't all generally have the same views. We all, this is not true. There is a lot of convergence in people's taste preferences. You could get real specific about some taste matters, and yeah, some people like cilantro, some people don't. But you could point to certain taste things. I can't think of too many people that would enjoy pouring a bucket of sand on their pizza. So I think it's similar to some examples that Don Loeb gives. So there are, in broad outlines, a lot of overlap in people's taste preferences, music preferences. A lot of people listen to the same music. How could so many people agree that Taylor Swift has great music? If music realism isn't true. So the amount of people that agree or disagree with something, you would have to ask a question, like psychologically speaking, why do they agree or disagree? And unless you could show that the reason they agree is because they're responsive to some sort of stance independent facts and it can't be accounted for in subjective terms, you haven't really shown that the reason why people agree is because they're aware of some sort of objective moral truth. People could just agree for mundane psychological reasons. Most people like pizza and french fries and ice cream. Again, it's not good evidence of gastronomic realism. Yeah, and people that disagree with those things, not particularly good evidence against it. It's just what most people think is just not good evidence one way or another.
That's the funny thing, that all of these moral relativists out there, yet none of them speak up to offer their morally relativistic defenses of rape, Holocaust, pedophilia. Well, very few of them do. Anyway.
What is he basing that on? He thinks relativists don't take moral stances on things? I don't see why they wouldn't.
As I said yesterday, Richard Dawkins did offer a bit of a defense of pedophilia. But even then, it was a half-hearted defense, and he's certainly in the minority among relativists. And that's interesting, isn't it? Number two, and disprove moral relativism. The fact that even moral relativists don't believe in it, I think that's irrelevant.
He hasn't established that
point. Number two, I think the objective nature of morality.
I can see though where the argument would be now, though. So maybe there is an argument to be had. So I could retract my remark. Most people agreeing with you isn't real. Well, it's not good evidence, but here would be the kind of argument. If most of the people that disagree with my position don't even consistently or genuinely endorse the alternative positions, but in fact implicitly endorse my position, this is some evidence against that position. I think that would be right. So I think maybe he's making a legitimate argument here. It's just not a very strong one. I also just don't think it's true that they're not. The people that say that they're relativists are not really relativists. I mean, again, this is all vague though. Which people? Which of these people is he talking about? What people where in what numbers? If it's like random people in the internet, we're not really dealing with any sort of rigorous quantifiable information we could really work with.
Can be seen and proven historically and anthropologically. If morality were subjective, if it were decided by individuals and societies, And if it did not have a source outside of ourselves, then the moral systems of every separate society should be like their clothing choices or their fashion. That is, it should be wildly different from place to place and from era to era. But that is not what you find.
That's absurd. It's just completely absurd. If people's taste preferences were subjective, then the kinds of food that people eat should be wildly different from one place to another. Well, turns out they're not. People all over the place like a lot of the same things. They like fried stuff, they like stuff with salt, they like stuff with sugar. It's nonsense. It's just not true. So there are lots. Humans are psychologically very similar to one another, and as a result of their psychological and physiological similarities, they tend to have similar food preferences. Although culture and environment does influence it, and individual differences influence people's differences in people's taste. Not everybody likes cilantro. Not everybody likes vanilla or whatever. Of course, there's taste differences. There's a whole hell of a lot more taste overlap than there is differences, though. So why would we think that moral standards wouldn't converge? Also, to a significant extent, a lot of moral standards are rooted in prudential considerations. So, you know, you might be against stealing. You don't want people to steal from you for completely reasonable reasons, and you might think, okay, well, why don't we all agree that we don't steal from each other? So, for the same reason, we coordinate on stop signs and what side of the road we're going to drive on, all sorts of practical questions that are not necessarily rooted in morality. We coordinate on our actions, and so that we can all better get along with one another. And to the extent that we construct a moral system together to better live in cooperative, functional societies, of course, there's going to be a lot of similarity in the standards people arrive at. So rules like, hey, it's not okay to just stab other people because you feel like it. You'll find those in all sorts of cultures. Well, why? This is a damn useful rule to have, right? So why would we predict if people were subjectivists that they'd have wildly different moral standards? I see no reason to predict that. None at all. It's a ridiculous suggestion. So subjectivism does not predict massive variation in people's moral standards. It's just not true. It's just not true.
In fact, if morality is subjective, then I think I should be able to find two things. If I'm looking around the world, I'm looking through history, different civilizations. I should be able to find civilizations that have no moral code whatsoever.
That simply doesn't follow. And it might actually be true that there are societies that have no moral codes, whatever. It's going to depend on exactly how you're defining moral code. But that's not an implication of subjectivism. So again, use the food analogy. If subjectivism about food preferences was true, we should find societies where they have no food preferences at all. Obviously ridiculous, right? Obviously ridiculous. So it's equally ridiculous here. If subjectivism is true, it in no way implies that there should be societies that have no moral standards. That is simply false. It is not an implication of subjectivism. I don't know what he's basing this on.
I should be able to find civilizations where nothing is considered right or wrong.
Okay, again, if subjectivism about taste preferences is true, then we should find societies where nothing is considered tasty or gross. Does that follow? No, that's ridiculous. This is a terrible, terrible line of reasoning here.
And number two, I should be able to find civilizations that have something close to the opposite of our own moral code.
Okay, so we should find societies where people would hate French fries and pizza and ice cream, and they would actually just all they want to eat is like dirty, rotting kale and rotting garbage and sand and dirt and like rusty nails, and they don't want to eat. If you show them chocolate or French fries or cheesecake, they'd hate all of it. Yep, that's what you would predict because after all, taste is subjective, so that's what we would predict. But we don't find that. We actually find everywhere people pretty much are going to like French fries and pizza. So I guess there must be gastronomic truths independent of our preferences. Of course, that doesn't follow. Of course, it's ridiculous. This is bad reasoning.
So civilizations where it's considered absolutely right to lie, murder, steal.
For the record, in the past, people like cultures would just completely massacre their neighboring civilizations. People would throw one another, they would enslave one another readily. People were extremely violent towards one another and towards non-human animals. By today's standards, human rights violations were an everyday occurrence on an almost nonstop basis. So, like, People were pretty awful in the past, and they're still very awful in many parts of the world. So, and think it's perfectly okay to be. I mean, he just gave an example of the worst people from World War II. Uh, those people had radically different perspectives about what was morally right or wrong, and that happened in living memory of at least a few people left were alive at the time. So it's not even like ancient history, and that people had radically different views about what was right or wrong than the rest of us, like views that are just so repugnant and horrific that it's almost unfathomable. And people in the past did human sacrifice. They'd carve people's hearts out. People would get guillotined on the regular. I mean, and people were okay. People would make a public spectacle of this stuff. So human cultural flexibility and capacity for wildly divergent moral standards is a well-established historical fact. So, how much more different does he think people needed to be?
I should find civilizations where cowardice is celebrated, integrity is
Yeah,
derided.
see, that doesn't follow. That doesn't follow. Why would you need to find a society where cowardice would be celebrated in order for subjectivism to be true?
Given the number of civilizations that have existed, given how separate they have often been, especially in the past, I think it's reasonable that an entirely subjective thing should manifest itself in extremely different ways. Opposite.
It's not reasonable. We share an evolved psychology. We share cultural. Okay, so some societies may not share too much culturally because they've been separate for a very long time, but we share similar environments. We share similar social groups. We have to adapt to environments and live in social groups in order to survive. Groups that didn't do that would die out. And so what you're seeing is a survivorship bias of the surviving cultures are the cultures that developed cooperative norms and got along with one another. That in no way indicates that the norms that they ended up developing are objectively true, or that they think that they're objectively true. This doesn't make a lot of this is not good reasoning here.
Ways. That's what that is what we find with truly.
Let me give an example. Let's suppose that you think it's really important for a society to have laws, and that without laws, society will collapse. And you look at the world and you observe all these societies, and they all have laws. Would you conclude, well, the laws must be objective? Well, no. That would be a good inference to draw, because we've already agreed that societies need laws to survive, and so if there's no societies alive without laws, is because they all died off. And so what you would have there is people could construct the laws. It wouldn't require that there be objective laws. It could just require only that the societies that survived reason their way towards various institutions that are conducive towards maintaining civilization. Lo and behold, the societies that hey, we already agree you need norms and institutions to survive, and then we know all these societies with norms and institutions have survived. Oh, what a coincidence! It's not a coincidence at all. I'm being sarcastic. So obviously, if that's necessary, then any you observe are going to exhibit the feature. And then the question would be: would we expect all the laws to be wildly different? Why? Why would we expect them to be different? Why would we expect one culture to say, yeah, it's okay to just steal whatever you want from anybody, and the other culture to be, nope, it's not okay to steal? No, because societies that have rules against stealing, if we expect them to function better than societies that don't, are more likely to survive. And so what you see really is the evolutionary and cultural accumulation of the construction of normative systems that are conducive towards societies flourishing. It's just the societies that are flourishing and the ones that exhibit the properties that are conducive to flourishing. It doesn't require that it be stance independently true that they ought to do so for them to do so, nor does it require that they have to believe that for them to do so. It's specious reasoning.
Objective things like fashion. Okay, so you can find societies where men wear pants, societies where they wear skirts, societies where people wear almost nothing, societies where women wear burqas, societies where they wear bikinis. If morality is subjective, then I should find a situation as diverse and contradictory as this, but I don't.
Yeah, this is real weird. I mean, how do we quantify the comparison in differences in fashion choice to differences in morality? I don't know how you would do that. But as far as fashion differences or clothing differences, keep in mind the vast array of differences in terms of like climate. So there's cold regions and hot regions, and a lot of clothing variation is going to vary for that reason. Then as far as aesthetic differences, you actually probably find quite a bit of convergence. So again, there's a question of here of how much you measure, how do you measure the differences within these practices, like fashion versus morality, and then how do you make interdomain comparisons? Is there more Is there more fashion diversity or more moral diversity between cultures? I don't know. Even if we say that there's more fashion diversity than moral diversity, okay, let's say that we say that that's the case. Again, I'm not sure that it is. Look, everyone everywhere. I bet we find sandals all over the place. I bet we find boots and skirts and pants and shirts and hats all over the place. What does that show? Uh, but the other issue here is that people adapt to their local climate, and so a lot of the clothing that they're going to wear is going to be suitable to their local climate. But as far as rules for people getting along with one another, whether you're living in a cold region or a hot region, if you're living in the tropics, by the water, landlocked, whatever it would be, rules against stealing or killing are going to be useful in similar ways. So again, we can account for overlap in people's moral standards in ways that are asymmetric with respect to differences in fashion choices. So, in other words, fashion choices, a lot of them are arbitrary, and a lot of the moral laws, institutions, and norms that we develop are not arbitrary. That doesn't mean that they are stance independently right or wrong. There are non arbitrary ways of living a healthier lifestyle versus not a healthier lifestyle. It doesn't mean that you have a stance independent obligation to pursue the healthy lifestyle. It just means, societies that say, hey, avoid eating rotting garbage and eat clean food after washing your hands, you're going to see more of those than you're going to see societies where they eat rotting garbage and refuse to engage in basic hygiene. Why? Because the societies that don't practice hygiene and are like, have all these gross practices are more likely to die off than the ones that do. Now, of course, historically, people got through that by building immune systems. But I'm just giving an example where if there's some factor that contributes to the survival of the societies or the individuals, you're more likely to observe those than ones that don't. That's just a fact about human behavior and the way natural selection works. So, he's not establishing any kind of strong point here.
What I find as I look at civilizations across the world in history is that there is unanimous agreement in principle on a number of moral points.
Unanimous agreement on what specifically? So, I mean, again, we could look at the history of societies, and people engage in some pretty heinous stuff in many societies.
Like it's wrong to lie, it's wrong to steal, to murder. It's good to be honest, to be humble, to be courageous.
Okay, so people all over the world, we find that people, again, you could qualify all of this because a lot of this is going to be rules that apply to in-group members and non-out-group members, and so there might be societies that, like, societies will go out and just massacre surrounding societies. So what does he mean by murder? Like, does he mean don't kill members of the in-group? Because yeah, sure, okay, so in every society where there's groups of people living, the groups are against people randomly killing other members of the group. So that somehow proves that they think morality is objective or that morality is objective. It's not good evidence of that at all. People can come to those conclusions without having to think that they're objectively true or without them being objectively true. So, again, if morality is, he's not drawing a distinction, it doesn't look like, between morality being subjective and then people believing morality is subjective. So that's one issue here. But the other is, even if people all over the world believe morality was subjective and morality was subjective, why would we predict that people would have different moral standards? So, I'm arguing that we wouldn't predict it, but he's not. He hasn't really given any reason to think that we would predict it. He's given some loose comparison to fashion, like, hey, we observe lots of variation in fashion, so why don't we observe lots of variation in morality? At least one point I make is we probably do observe quite a bit of variation in morality. But even if we set that aside and just say, yeah, people morally are pretty similar, why might that be? Is the only explanation for that there are stance independent moral truths and or that people believe that there are stance independent moral truths, or do we have alternative explanations for that? It's a little weird to just leap immediately to it's got to be the stance independent moral facts that account for this. Why? Why? I mean, all over the world, people wear shoes. I bet people have independently invented shoelaces several times. People may have independently invented wheels. People may have independently invented like levers and pulleys. So why? Well, because the world is a certain way. And so to extract resources from the world or accomplish physical tasks in the world, certain kinds of inventions will recur and be independently invented in different places and different times. Same thing with people's institutions and practices. So, various types of, like, marriage. Did all marriage descend from the same source, or did different societies invent marriage? I bet different societies invented marriage. I don't know. We could look into the history of it. But a lot of cultural practices can emerge and develop independently because they serve various functions for people. And insofar as moral standards serve functions for cooperative societies, it should come as no surprise that people develop similar cooperative enterprises. and established similar moral rules because humans live pretty similar lives when it comes to their social behavior. So whether you're living in you know, in the ancient world, whether you were living in Sweden or you were living in some equatorial region or you were living in Australia, it's important to be able to maintain your property, to resolve conflicts, to acquire resources from the environment, to address issues of interpersonal conflict within members of your group, to address issues of conflict with other groups, to address marital and relationship conflicts, to manage hierarchies. All of these are going to be social problems that you need to solve. And it should come as no surprise that people have come up with similar solutions. All over the world, people encounter similar social challenges. Living in a group it poses similar sorts of challenges, regardless of where you are in the world and what region you're in. But clothing, would you wear the same clothing if you were living in an equatorial region or you're living in Scandinavia? Of course not. So pointing, oh, look at all these fashion differences, look how different they are, but the moral differences, there's fewer of those. Okay, but is that consistent with mundane sociological, psychological, and other empirical facts about human societies? Sure as hell looks like it to me. So why would we need to bring in stance independent moral facts to account for those similarities? I think it's simple. We wouldn't need to. And this is a bad explanation. And this is a bad proposal. And this is not good reasoning. Okay, let's have a look at the chat. Oh, not that much chat at this point. Okay, LPQ Silver says, you do see variation in ethical standards based on cultural and religious context, which can appear ridiculous across cultural contexts. So what Walsh is saying, you would observe does happen. Right. So that's one line of response to this, is you just do observe this. I mean, keep in mind, there were societies where people did like human sacrifice and stuff. So people have pretty different moral standards. Mason same says, it seems that what is relativist is whatever Walsh doesn't like and wants to dismiss with the wave of his hand. Well, I don't know. Yeah, Hayden puts it very concisely. Hayden Walton says, "We are all the same species. Our morality would be virtually the same." Right? Yeah. I mean, it's not that much of a stretch to think humans are pretty similar, and so we're going to develop similar social systems. Boy says, "Why do people almost universally wear heavy garments in cold environments and light garments in warm environments if fashion is just subjective?" Well, one, we could put some points against what I'm saying here. One would be that it's not entirely subjective. So there are going to be these like non-subjective features that are influencing what people end up doing. So that would be one point. But yeah, so why do people almost universally wear heavy garments in cold environments and light garments in warm environments? Oh, right. And the other point would be some of that's not fashion. Some of that's just practicality. So we would have to distinguish fashion from practical considerations. So what clothing people wear is a slightly different distinction from what people consider fashionable or not. But like take something like music. So uh, in the case of music, does everybody everywhere have radically different music? I mean, this is going to be kind of a lose lose. I mean, one, yeah, people do have quite different music, but there is actual facts about the way human cognition works, where certain types of melodies, rhythms, and those sorts of things are going to be more appealing or less appealing to people. And so you would expect people to develop similar patterns and routines in the kind of music that they construct. Does that mean music is objective? No, it does not. So there are shared facts between people about our shared human psychology that causes us to like some music and dislike other music. It doesn't mean that there's a fact on the matter about what music is good and what music is bad, independent of human preference. In the case of clothing, some of the practical considerations that will go into people's clothing choices are not just going to be fashion. It's going to be this thicker clothing will prevent the cold and this lighter clothing will not prevent the cold. Those facts are true independent of people's fashion preferences, tastes, and those sorts of things. Well, it's an unserious remark. I still think it's worth taking seriously anyway. But the point here is just that even if we consider something like music to be like a matter of taste, like a person can't really be incorrect if they like, some weird song or something. I might think that their tastes are gross or weird or something. "Ugh, I don't like the music they like." But it'd be weird to say that they're incorrect if they enjoy some music I don't like. But there are going to be probably quite a few similarities in at least as in a fundamental way, in the kinds of music people find enjoyable versus the kinds of music that they don't find enjoyable. Same thing with art. There's going to be a lot of similarities. I bet if you showed artwork around the world and you show like beautiful environment, like nature scenes to people all over the world, they'll tend to like them. And if you show like really grotesque stuff, like I don't know, bunch of popped pimples or something like that. People are going to go, ugh, all over the place. And so, okay, so people's aesthetic preferences, there's going to be overlap there. We share psychology in common with one another. Is this such a shocker? Like it shouldn't be. Not like basically convergence in values or preferences is just not particularly good evidence of realism in that domain. All right.
Same sort of person admired and the same sort of person despised everywhere. Now, it's true that you find civilizations where terrible evils are accepted and commonplace. Obviously, Nazi Germany, every slave-holding society is another example. But you notice that even in cases where terrible, monstrous evils were accepted, they were still rationalized and justified according to the same moral code. So, murder was illegal under the Nazis, but they just claimed that exterminating the Jews was not murder. Now, that claim was ridiculous, obviously, but the fact remains that even they felt the need to pay homage to this moral code and to pretend that they were following it. Why? What was the point of that?
What was the point of people trying to justify and rationalize their actions? Well, just because they justify and rationalize them doesn't mean they actually hold the same values. It's a weird claim.
And it's because, in fact, we expected them to follow it, to have followed it. It's because we rejected the idea that societies and individuals.
He seems to be implying that there's like a shared code, and that everybody's trying to rationalize how all their behavior comports with the shared code. And I don't think that that's true. But it's not super clear what exactly he's saying.
Invent their own morality, that we could justify putting the Nazi war criminals on trial and then hanging them. If morality were really subjective, we would have no basis for condemning them because that was their.
What? We would also have no basis for not condemning them. Subjectivism isn't inconsistent with condemning people. You just judge them by your standards. Again, be an appraiser relativist, and you say, hey, I am against genocides. And so these people committed genocide, and so we will hold them accountable for it. Who cares if they think what they did was okay? I don't care.
Their morality. But we rejected that and said there's only one. You broke it. You know you broke it. And now
there doesn't have to be the belief that there's only one morality. All there needs to be for me to judge someone else is my moral standards. That's all you need. And I could recognize a bunch of different people have different moral standards. Okay, well, whatever. I'm going to employ my moral standards. I'm going to act on my moral standards. I think this is already what we do. We impose our moral standards on other people. And I would continue to impose my standards on other people, regardless of whether they thought they were objectively right or wrong. They're my standards. That's what matters to me. Isn't that what matters to everybody else? What kind of standards are you imposing on people? If you're imposing your own values, or what? You're imposing values that are not your own values. So there's values you think they're objective, but like what? Are you, if you're for them, then are you imposing them on people because you're for the objective moral values? In other words, you value the objective moral values? Well, then you're imposing things on people because you value them. It's just, in one case, you're outsourcing your values. So I value my moral standards, and I will then therefore impose them on other people. If you're a realist, what is it that you value? You value whatever the objective moral facts are. You think they're a certain thing. And then what? Well, because you value complying with whatever they are, then you impose whatever they are on people. Like, in what sense? Whether or not you directly care about it. So, like, if you're a realist, you go, okay, well, if murder is wrong objectively, then I'll be against murder. If murder is permissible objectively, then I'll consider it permissible. I'm indifferent to which one it is. Whichever one you tell me it turns out is objectively right or wrong, that's the one I'm going to act on. Is that how realists want to operate? Because I would think realists go, oh, well, I'm against murder, and so I want to oppose murder. And then you come along and say, oh, well, it turns out objectively murder is wrong. Okay, well, I was going to oppose it anyway. So realism does nothing. Okay, and then what's the alternative? So I'm really against murder. Realism comes along and says, hey, actually, it turns out murder is totally okay. In fact, you should go out murdering people. That's what realism says. What would the reaction to that be? Hopefully it's, oh, wait, realism is pro-murder? Well, then I guess I don't care about the objective moral facts. I'm not going to comply with them. So once again, your own values are the final arbiter here. In other words, for me, as an anti-realist, my own values is the final arbiter. If you're a realist, are your values not the final arbiter? What's the final arbiter? You just comply with whatever the moral facts are, even if you don't want to? How does that work? What are you, a puppet? Like whatever they are, you just I must conform, even if I don't want to. No, you conform with them if you want to, and you don't if you don't. And so you're doing the same thing I am. You're acting on your own values, and either you value the objective moral truths or you don't. So your values are still in the driver's seat. Our values are always in the driver's seat. Like, if anything, I would say subjectivism is inevitable. You can't help but act on your subjective moral values. The only way you could even act on whatever you believe the objective moral values are is if you subjectively value complying with objective moral values. And if you didn't do that, how would you comply with them? Let's say you do not value, you don't care at all what the objective moral truths are. You don't care. And so now someone goes, okay, well, here's the list. Here's the list of the objective moral truths. And you believe it. You believe that's the stuff on the list, but you don't care about doing any of it. What would you do? I wouldn't comply with it. How would you comply with it? How would you comply with it? It's kind of like asking, it's kind of like operate on this assumption. Okay, people only do things they're motivated to do. Now, suppose you're not motivated to comply with the objective moral facts. Would you comply with them? No. So that's basically how I think about it. All right.
Now you face the consequences. In slaveholding countries like our own prior to the 1860s.
Yeah, Mason makes a point here. Walsh may want to review the history because the same society was judged some Nazis also had no problem granting amnesty and offering jobs to others. Yeah, a lot of people ended up just living out their lives, right? Reflective Journey says that is kind of dualist, Lance. How's that dualist? What are you talking about?
Slavery was justified on the basis that slaves weren't fully people. What does that mean? It means that even slaveholders recognized that you shouldn't treat people like that. But
yeah, I see where he's trying to get this. Like, actually, people have similar moral codes. I think it's an open question whether people thought that the people that they were harming were not people. There may be context in which they did, but there's plenty of context in which I would bet people go, yeah, those are people, and I don't like them, and I'm against them. So, but even there, okay, so dehumanization may be an important part of human cognition to motivate people to treat other people badly. It doesn't show realism. It just might show that humans might have a natural impulse to not readily cause harm to other people. We could have evolved aversions to harming others. They could be culturally acquired aversions to harming others. And then when there's context in which it would be, it would serve the interests of some group you're acting on behalf of or some ideology you're committed to harm other people, it would take some extra work to motivate you to cause harm to people. I've heard that when people go to war, it's often difficult for people to fire a gun. It's like the thought of killing other people is really aversive to people. And so insofar as people have a shared aversion to causing harm, again, it doesn't show that they believe that it stands independently wrong. I have an aversion to certain smells and foods. It doesn't mean I think their stance independent. And a lot of other people are going to have a similar aversion to certain smells and foods. Like all over the place, people don't like the smells of farts. That doesn't mean farts are objectively smelly. So this idea that everyone thinks this way or people are inclined to think that way and therefore realism, no, or therefore they believe in realism or they have realist intuitions, nope. So all of this has to do with convergence in people's first order values or judgments, and he seems to be jumping from people have similar first order judgments and values to therefore the second order claim of realism is true, or it's still unclear. People implicitly believing in it. That the claim that most people implicitly endorse realism is true. Neither of those claims follow, and they're not supported by this.
They rationalized that, well, these aren't people. A bad rationalization, but the fact that they made it at all is kind of instructive, isn't it? Okay. But you might say that, well, all of these societies I've talked about so far, they all interacted with each other. They came from the same human pool, as it were. So their agreement on moral points is not very surprising, because
that seems like a good point.
Because of this interaction. So fair enough. Okay, let's look at an example that should absolutely.
So wait, so he just says fair enough, because that was a pretty good response from people. These societies aren't all operating independently of one another. So the extent that they influence one another, it's not surprising. Something I point out all the time, if you're going to argue that convergence or shared moral values is evidence that people are realistic, that realism is true. Okay, well, there's Coca-Cola, McDonald's all over the place. Is that evidence of gastronomic realism? Nope.
absolutely prove moral relativism if moral relativism is true.
Hold on. What?
Okay. Let's look at an example that should absolutely prove moral relativism if moral relativism is true.
Okay. Looking forward to hearing this.
Let's look at the meeting of Indian civilizations and Europeans. So here we have people that are entirely separated, living in isolation from one another.
Yeah, he seems to be thinking if relativism is true, but people could just not be acting like relativists. They could just not be relativists. So whether relativism is true doesn't turn on whether people act like relativists or believe relativism. Although I'm not sure how much it would influence people's behavior anyway.
Who had never come in contact, never been exposed to each other, never exercised the slightest influence on one another prior to their meeting.
Wait, so was there literally zero European contact prior to the British arrival in India? Is that the case?
Here we have a chance for relativistic morality to really show itself. If morality is really relative, when you've got these two sides of the world not come in contact with each other,
Hold on.
moral relativism is true. Let's look. So here we have people that are entirely separated, living in isolation from one another, who had never come.
Does he mean like in people in the new world? Maybe that's what he means. I thought he was talking about India.
In contact, never been exposed to each other, never exercised the slightest
Because that would make more sense of like the total lack of exposure.
influence on one another prior to their meeting. Here we have a chance for relativistic morality to really show itself. If morality is really relative, when you've got these two sides of the world not come in contact with each other, and you have this completely relative thing like called morality, it should manifest itself in wildly different ways. But that's not what you find. Incredibly, although the Indians and the Europeans were extremely different in many ways, they still had the same fundamental ideas about morality. So to prove
Did they?
my point, I'll take the most challenging.
Well, again, they might have had did they? When people would travel to other parts of the world, they eat the food there. Again, evidence of gastronomic realism. Whoa, they like the food there. They don't eat radically different food.
Example for my position, we can look at the Aztecs and the Spanish. Now, here we have two very, very different sets of people, and the Aztecs practiced human sacrifice on a massive scale. Yet even they had basically the same kinds of rules and laws and moral ideas as the Spanish. Homicide, rape.
Why is this supposed to be evidence of moral realism? Yeah, sure. Okay. They had similar rules. And that implies realism because? Like, how is that evidence of realism? Like, even if convergence were some evidence of realism, it's such weak evidence. It just doesn't count for that much.
Perjury, theft, robbery, sedition, incest, public drunkenness, etc. They were all condemned both as legal and moral infractions.
Yeah,
Now,
again, if you look at this from a social constructivist perspective, this could readily be accounted for by the rules that both societies created being conducive to those societies flourishing. It's not like people don't pull their moral values out of a hat.
yeah, they ripped the hearts out of their human sacrifices, but they didn't consider that murder. So again, which doesn't make it okay, obviously. Now, if you're a moral relativist, that does make it okay.
No, it doesn't. Whether it makes it okay would be relative to your values. If you're an appraiser relativist, it would be okay if it's consistent with your values and not okay if it's inconsistent with your values. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah. So, it depends whether you're an appraiser or agent relativist.
That's the whole point of moral relativism. They didn't consider it to be bad, which means it wasn't.
Yeah. So people are pointing stuff out like this. Even the gastronomic realism is not fully subjective. Very bitter things are bitter for everyone. So you just have to draw a distinction between the descriptive facts and the normative facts. Gastronomic realism is a normative realist position. So gastronomic realism is consistent. So gastronomic anti-realism is consistent with thinking that there are stance-independent facts about whether food is bitter or not. What it's not consistent with is judging that there are stance-independent facts about whether the food is good or not. So the descriptive facts can float free independent of the normative facts. Realism is specifically realism about the normative facts. So this isn't really going to be diagnostic of a whole lot. This would be consistent with realism and anti-realism.
As someone who believes in objective morality, I say that that's not an excuse. It was still bad. But the point is, again, you see this thing, this invisible moral code, which appears to be the same everywhere, and which even the most evil civilizations felt the need to work around.
You have this framing is just highly suspicious. So there's this shared moral code we all have, and people got to work around it. I'm not buying that account. I think there may be some shared fundamental tendencies that people have. People tend to care about private property. They tend to care about hierarchy. They tend to be against harm. So there might be stuff like that, and so there might be an extent to which our predisposition to be against harm, to be in favor of fairness, to respect hierarchies, to care about loyalty, to be against certain sorts of actions we might consider impure, that sort of thing. Something like Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory, something like that may be partially a product of our evolved psychology. But if that's the case, then what you would predict is that people would act in their evolved psychology. So you compare all over the world, people have similar attitudes about what makes other people attractive or not. Does that mean that people are stance independently attractive? No, because that it's a very weird thing. Like our squirrels that find other squirrels attractive incorrect because we've converged on the correct aesthetic standards of beauty, and actually only humans are beautiful. I mean, it's ridiculous. So when organisms share an evolutionary history together, when they're members of the same species, a tendency for them to develop similar norms of conduct amongst one another, even when they live independently of one another, is no surprise at all, and it's not inconsistent at all with those values not being objectively right or wrong. So, in other words, the mere fact that humans all over the world share similar moral standards is not good evidence that moral realism is true, and it's not good evidence that those people are moral realists. Now, is it maybe some small, like marginal amount of evidence? Sure. But if that's the case, there's also small marginal evidence of gastronomic realism, of music realism, of cinematic realism, of fashion realism. There'd be a whole bunch of like to the extent in all of these domains, there's quite a bit of convergence around the world. People eat pizza all over the place. McDonald's is in most countries. Starbucks is all over the place. That doesn't mean coffee goodness realism is true. I mean, that'd be ridiculous. So convergence just is not particularly dispositive one way or another. And treating it as such, I think is revealing, because he doesn't really have strong arguments.
So
We're about at the
that's
end
why
here.
I think moral relativism is false, because I see no evidence for it at all. All I see when I look inside myself and when I look outwardly to human societies, our own, other societies, civilization, when I look through history, all I see is evidence that morality is objective. It is a thing that it's not something you invent or come up with. It's a thing that you recognize.
Sure looks to me like societies all over the world have created social systems and institutions of norms and values that largely piggyback on and expand on a shared evolved psychology. I don't see much reason at all to look like, when I look out at the world, I don't see realism anywhere. Morality looks like a constructed human invention.
Which is why all of these civilizations came to the same recognition, although they all failed.
Almost done here, but I get a few more comments. Femboy Origami, you use things like fashion, music, food, and movies as things that are uncontroversially subjective. I'm not saying they're uncontroversially subjective. I'm making an intersubjective appeal. If you think these things are subjective, then there will be force behind these arguments that I'm presenting in comparison. If you don't, then you might not. It's you say, might these follow from aesthetic realism, which is most philosophers support anyways? So the Phil Papers survey found that about 40% of philosophers endorsed aesthetic objectivism. It's not a majority. I think it was the modal response, because I don't think it was like more than 40% that endorsed anti-realism. I think you had a lot of people choosing other. In fact, let's just look it up. I do want to wrap up the video though. Let's get the exact numbers. I'm looking it up now. Yeah. Let's throw them up here. So what you could see here, where's that search? As you could see here, you have 43% lean towards objective and then 40% towards subjective. And then you have about 23% choosing other. So yeah, that's interesting. You don't have a consensus or like people strongly leaning towards that. I don't know what, um, I don't know exactly how people were interpreting that question, but it's not a majority. Okay.
Fail to follow it in
Okay. Finboy corrects. Wasn't enough to say a plurality. Yeah, it is. It is the more common view by a couple percentage points. It's certainly like it's not like it's a weird fringe view among philosophers. It is the more common of any particular view. It is the most common. I would say it's the modal view, but I don't think most people know what that means.
various different ways, and some to worse degrees than others, but they all saw basically the same thing. A really relative thing, a really subjective thing should be various. It should be contradictory, especially when you see that it's, especially in cases where it's developed, where you have two systems that have developed isolated from one another. But that's not the case with morality, which tells me that it is not, in fact, relative. It is objective. It is simply a truth that we all see and we choose to follow or not. All right, I'll leave it there.
Okay.
Godspeed.
All right, everybody. I can't believe that took me 3 hours. Ugh, probably belabored a lot of points. I got to work on concision and being, saying everything in a lot more. I'm already being wordy. I need to work on saying things in fewer words. I think I'll leave it there. And thanks everybody for being here. I hope you all had a great Christmas. And I'm going to head out. So please like the video, leave comments in the comment section, subscribe to the channel, do all that stuff, and I'll catch y'all later. Have a great Christmas. If I don't see you or you don't see me, have a happy new year, all that stuff. And I'll see y'all soon. Take care.